Bet the Board.
What do you mean you don't bet? I mean, I don't bet. You know, I don't gamble. I don't. I never have, and I never will. Yeah, right. I'll bet you $20 I can get you gambling before the end of the day.
You owe me 15 grand, pal.
Pay him. Pay that man his money.
It's the Bet the Board podcast.
God likes me. He really, really likes me.
In the end, I wound up right back where I started. I could still pick winners, and I could still make money for all kinds of people back home. And why mess up a good thing?
Here's Payne Insider and Todd Fuhrman.
Welcome into the Bet the Board podcast, your preseason college football Power 5 previews roll on. The Big 12, the topic on the docket today, how the New Look League will go through its final season with two perennial blue bloods in Texas and Oklahoma. I am your host, Todd Fuhrman, joined as always for the college football preview series by the two men who do the real heavy lifting around here, Payne Insider and Brad Powers. Gentlemen, hopefully you both had a very fine 4th of July, and you're looking forward to a brief respite after we knock out the Big 12 with the SEC looming on deck in just a few short weeks.
I have war flashbacks, and I never served after last night, to be honest with you. That was a tough night here in the Valley.
It was interesting to say the least, Brad, and funny to hear you say that because I was fishing ash out of my pool this morning at about 5:45, and I saw more of my neighbors lighting off fireworks that I was convinced going to end up like JPP than ever before in my entire adult life.
Oh, wow.
Starting hot. The pool, have you got that figured out? Last time I saw your pool.
Here we go.
So Todd, we're just going off the rails already. We did before the show, but the first time I've actually seen Todd frustrated because he plays it cool corporate guy, always cool, right? We've had, gazillion negotiations in the past, just Mr. Calm Cool. I'm at his house and the pool is having a heating issue. It's having a filling issue. I've never seen you so frustrated. It was absolutely epic. And then there was an agitator, an instigator in the fold, which made it all the more hilarious.
Yeah, Brad, let me tell you one thing about Payne. He can normally be sympathetic. I use that term facetiously there. I've never seen him more excited his entire life, as long as I've known or worked with him, trying to suppress a smirk that basically expanded across his face as he watched me struggle as the hot tub filled, it didn't fill, it couldn't heat, and he had to walk away multiple times. So little to say, he got his 15 minutes of entertainment value out of all of that. But no, we've since been able to correct those kind of issues. I've learned some of the tech. Now, if you ask me to fix anything else around the house, look, I'm not really worth a whole heck of a lot by any stretch of the imagination. But before you over there start hurling stones living in a glass house, I'm not sure you're the handiest guy on the face of the earth either, Mr. Payne.
Oh, I'm not, and I don't pretend to be. I, employ people to make my life much easier.
Typical Payne answer, Brad. There we go.
I'm a computer guy. That's it. Computer, football, betting. That's it. That's all I do. I don't do anything else very well.
Yeah. Well, you want to peel back the curtain on that. I can't tell our listeners how many times you can't get your headphones to sync when we're trying to record audio first thing in the morning. And it's 4-letter word after 4-letter word with the right headphone working, the left headphone working. So what goes around comes around. And all right, let's get into some of the college football on display today. And Brad, before we get into the individual teams, I do want to get your take on the current state of the Big 12. Mentioned at the top, we obviously have 4 new transitional members, 3 coming from the AAC. BYU ends its 10-plus years as an independent to join a conference. We have Texas and Oklahoma in their swan song. When you look at the overall landscape, did the Big 12 do a good job in hand-selecting programs that can allow this league to operate at a relatively high level, knowing that you lose the 2 most recognizable brands?
Yeah, I think with what was available for the rest of the group of 5, I thought you couldn't have done better. They got big city markets like Houston, obviously Orlando with UCF. You got a historically rich program in BYU that's got a lot of fan support. Cincinnati's been on the upswing here for the last decade plus. I think they did a good job. And one thing, I guess my biggest takeaway is, with the exception of this year, because we'll get into it on how we think Texas is head and shoulders above everybody else, but I think moving forward, there's going to be opportunity in this league because I think it's going to be such parity-driven, and the opportunity is going to come along. I mean, in your conference future prices between these, remaining 12 programs, I think this is one where it would be probably okay to take a shot on a long shot each and every year because this is a case where you could see an Iowa State win it one year and then go back to 3-9 the next year, or an Oklahoma State make a run, or any of the remaining programs make a run at it and get 30-41 one year, and then they have a losing record the next.
You mentioned parity, Brad, and Payne, I know you love these questions that are more for sports talk media, but since I'm the host, I get to ask them to you and piss you off at the same time. If you're looking at the league, I mean, Brad talked about how it could be an annual reversal. If there's one program that will remain that you'd want to buy stock in now in terms of their staying power, is there one that stands out?
Yeah, I think it's easy. You're talking about the teams that are remaining, or any of the teams that are now in this new look conference.
Yeah, no, I'm saying the teams that'll remain. So take Texas and Oklahoma out of the equation. What the Big 12 will look like 2024 and beyond.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's easy. Like the one team that's positioned best for, I think, this season that's new, and then moving forward, as long as the Big 12 actually exists, it's UCF. Right, like they've built their foundation and they operate in the hottest talent bed. And you have a former SEC coach that knows what it takes on the recruiting trail. Admissions are really soft, not as soft as USF, but pretty much the softest in the state. You have great weather. Kids can keep more of their money. And, I kind of harken back. Like if Florida State and Miami can't break out from the ACC within 24 to 36 months, UCF is going to be earning more from their Big 12 TV deal, which is going to enhance, the recruiting spend. But I think, just in totality, right, like this was a no-brainer for the 4 new schools joining, a Power 5 conference. In their minds, the Big 12, if that goes away, surely the AAC is going poof, right? And BYU wasn't going to garner SEC or Big Ten interest, so it becomes a free roll for all 4 of these schools. We'll take the extra money now for how many ever years from the Big 12, and we'll hop on the bigger boat and hope it stays afloat longer. And for the Big 12, like they've lost their top 2 in Texas and Oklahoma, so now they're playing the quantity strength in numbers game. So all sides needed each other here. But I think it's UCF to answer the specific question.
It's so interesting because you read between the lines for the Big 12. They haven't exactly been out there saying, nope, we're perfectly fine with the current footprint we have once Texas and Oklahoma are gone. Still kicking the tires, as you guys mentioned, in the Pac-12. If there's a program or two that might be available to pick off, whether it's bringing in Colorado and Utah to recreate that Utah-BYU rivalry, going after the Arizona schools. So clearly a conference in flux, not only on the field this year in terms of what the middle class will look like, but obviously what the program assemblage can be going forward. So no doubt going to be fascinating to try and watch that. You mentioned UCF and the rich recruiting footprint that it has with relatively lax academic standards and some of the on-campus dynamic. Couldn't be more diametrically opposed than the first program we'll hit on, and we'll run these down in alphabetical order, starting with the Baylor Bears, who see their win total at 7. Right now in that 15-1 range or thereabouts to win the conference. And when you look at what Dave Aranda's team did a season ago, they finished 6th and 7 after starting 10th in the preseason AP poll. A lot of Bet the Board listeners remember back to their trip to Provo and exactly how we were done dirty with one of our best bets early in the season. Baylor lost final 4 games after starting the season 6-3. When you look at 2019 and 2021, Baylor got to the Big 12 championship, winning the conference in 2021 on the way to the Sugar Bowl in each campaign. Then in 2020, team goes 2-7. 2022 version crashed again as well. But Dave Aranda has stabilized the ship, tied for the most wins at Baylor in his first 3 seasons with 20. This program dealt a very fortuitous bounce. They'll play a school record 8 home games in 2023. But Brad, if Baylor is going to get back to the heights that we talked about in 2021, they're going to need to get more consistency offensively. Led by offensive coordinator Jeff Grimes. It's a group that finished 44th in total offense last year. But I'll give you the lowest hanging fruit out there. I watch Blake Shapen on a week-in, week-out basis. I'm not sure he's going to be the quarterback that finishes the season down there in Waco as QB1.
Yeah, I will say this, though. I mean, with so much regression last year and with Dave Aranda's past experience on the defense side of the ball, you would think it was the offense that really was the significant drop-off. And, shockingly, it was the defense that was the bigger problem, at least with Baylor a year ago. But like you mentioned, the Baylor offense leaves a lot to be desired. Starting with the quarterback position, you look at Chapin. Personally, I don't think he's that good either, Todd. I mean, his numbers were okay last year, 63%. I mean, threw too many interceptions, obviously, with 10. I mean, you look at total QBR, he was 73rd, below average. That's not going to cut it. Watched the spring game, and I mean, I was surprised that they've already named him the starting quarterback, because what I watched was I saw the kid from Mississippi State, Sawyer Robertson. I thought he really pushed him in the spring game. I thought this was going to be a battle that would head into fall camp, to be perfectly frank with you. So,
honestly, Brad, my feeling is they did that because Chapin has been so shaky from a confidence standpoint that they had to, maybe because they wanted to keep him on campus. But I'm with you. I think that if he were to struggle, say week 2 against Utah, that you could see them go to Sawyer Robertson even before you got into conference play.
Exactly. I mean, you got Utah. You mentioned all the home games. Utah and Texas are 2 home games already in September, so there could be a chance that Chapin has struggled. And one good thing that he has around him, I really like the running back core. They had Richard Reese, smaller type of running back, 5'9", 175. Very productive as a freshman last year, almost 1,000 yards, 14 touchdowns. Whenever he was in the game, he mainly got the ball. I mean, 28% of his carries went for a first down, so super productive there. They got a bigger kid, Quaylen Jones. He played more snaps. He was featured more in the receiving game. They also bring in Dominic Richardson from Oklahoma State, who led the Cowboys last year in rushing and has had a couple of really good games against Baylor the last couple of seasons. So very deep there. They even have a true freshman running back that popped to me in Bryson Washington in the spring game. So good thing for Chapin is he can turn around and hand it off, and he's got a productive running back core. The wide receiver position leaves a little bit to be desired, to say the least for me. I mean, I like the Baldwin kid. He's super fast. They run a bunch of these like jet sweeps, but with the wide receivers, he's one of them that gets the ball quite a bit. They brought in a transfer from Arkansas. I think he'll start in Ketron Jackson. The tight ends positions, I think more of a strength compared to the wide receivers. I think you'll see a lot of 2 tight end sets. They really work the tight ends again in the spring game. I like the North Texas kid, Jake Roberts. No relation to Jake the Snake. For your old-time WWF fans. Looking at that, I mean, I could see where, they're going to set up the offense with some play action, throw the tight ends, work the ground game. I can see, I mean, it's pretty simple what they should be doing offensively. Now, the question is the offensive line. I mean, they lost a ton of experience. 3 guys that were 6-year players and a 4-year starter at left tackle. They bring in a pair of BYU kids, their brothers, Clark and Campbell Barrington. They have familiarity in the system because, keep in mind, Baylor's offense coordinator came over from BYU a couple years ago. So we'll see what they can do there. But overall, it's about flat compared to last year. I think they've upgraded the skill positions. I'm going to put up the offensive line down. I don't think if you're looking for Baylor to make that jump back up to Big 12, competition, contention, it's not going to happen on the offense. The defense is going to have to go back to being, top 20, and I'll let Payne dive into that.
Well, you mentioned the defense, Brad, and of course, obviously, it didn't sit well with Dave Aranda last year. They make a change at defensive coordinator, bringing Matt Powledge back in from Oregon after the dismissal of Ron Roberts. Powledge does have experience as the safeties coach during Aranda's first 2 years down there in Waco, and his quote this offseason said the Bears want to get up in people's faces and really challenge them at the line of scrimmage in press man coverage. Payne, I'm not sure that may be a great recipe for success, because you and I watched Baylor's secondary last year, and while I don't have 4.4 speed by any stretch of the imagination, I feel like I might have been able to get open 12 to 15 yards downfield and create a big play or two.
I think both you guys have hinted at the exact things that I picked up defensively. And just in general, like, Baylor was flying high after their 21 season. And, like, yes, things broke right, caught some breaks. But this defense was somewhat shockingly bad, especially the front 7. And you watch them just collapse down the stretch, just shocking, right? I mean, this was a defense that was top 8 the year prior, and now they're outside our top 55 last year. And, we all think the world of Dave Aranda as a defensive mind. You mentioned him bringing in Matt Powledge again to be the DC. It's like Powledge failed, right? In a one-and-done season as Oregon's co-DC. Dan Lanning, shit canned them, basically. Up front is really where I think Baylor's defensive metrics were shockingly bad last season. They got mauled, right? Just bullied outside the top 100 in defensive line yards. And I think that's shocking when you think about, a defensive tackle in Siaki, like taken in the first 100 picks. You also look at some of the poor standard down metrics. They couldn't get opposing offenses in enough predictable situations or off the field quickly. There was no pressure. There was no havoc. There were no negative plays being created. Baylor's outside the top 80 in all of those areas. You look at what they return, it's like, yes, TJ Franklin, Gabe Hall, nice players. There's a reason they're both back for year 5, right? Cooper Lands is a sophomore, only played 40-ish snaps last season. I think he's going to be relied upon in the middle. They added Jarrell Boykins Jr., a top 10 D lineman from the JUCO ranks, and then you have Jermon Randolph, who kind of comes off the edge in that jack role. He's improved each season, 11% pressure rate on pass rush snaps. Still on the team despite an April arrest. The guy I am most interested seeing up front, though, and not a lot of people will know him. He's not a household name. I'm sure you guys obviously know, but Byron Vaughns. He transfers in from Utah State. I think more of him than 24/7 Sports. He has elite get off and lateral movement, great bend and twitch. Hopefully, you have Iran to coach him up a little bit, work on some finishing moves. The key issue is he's a little bit undersized. He played end at 225. So my source told me that Vaughns is up to 238 pounds this offseason when he was talking to teams in the portal. FSU kicked the tires on Vaughns, and I know Brad's Irish were involved there as well. Ultimately, he chose to go back to the Big 12, was originally a Texas commit. Linebacker group loses Dylan Doyle, right? Superb run defender, good tackler. Matt Jones is back for a 5th season, replacement level player. You saw Aranda hit the portal for Mike Smith Jr. from Liberty. He has been all the rave this spring. If you're reading articles, had a great 2022 season, but he's stepping up in class. The secondary, to your main point, Todd, it was a question mark heading into last season for us, and I know it was something we pointed out in our preview. I went back and listened to it the other day. That unit wound up being horrific, and it was very clear that Aranda didn't trust his guys back there because he played off coverage at one of the highest rates in his coaching career, and Baylor got chunked because of that soft coverage. They're outside the top 90 in passing success rate allowed. The rare times that Baylor got its opponent in known passing situations, they still couldn't get a stop, even if they knew it was coming through the air. So you mentioned some of those changes, right? The claim of more press man coverage. It's the point of emphasis this offseason, right? A safety coach was fired. And, I don't know if they have the talent to do that, right? The lone difference maker that returns is Devin Lemire. Really stepped up last season, had the expanded role, 79 coverage grade. Past him, I think we're still seeing battles in fall camp to decide the rest because we know Baylor plays 5 back there. You have Tevin Williams and Alfonso Allen who are going to take on expanded roles. Both graded out pretty well, but only 175 combined snaps last season. Bryson Jackson in year 6, he's making the transition from corner to safety. You have Isaiah Dunson transferring in from Miami. Probably tells you what you need to know because the Hurricanes are dying for corner help. Johnny Carter transfers in from Utah State, was never a replacement level player in his 4 seasons at the Mountain West level. I think the secondary is very much unsettled again. We'll see what fall camp brings. But the question mark for me is like if Baylor does play more press, right? Do they have the horses to execute that, or are we going to see their explosive pass defense rates increase to the negative? I think when you look at schedule too, we're projecting 6 offenses on Baylor's schedule inside the top 30, barring Utah is healthy. 2 more in the top 45. Only 2 offenses on Baylor's schedule outside our top 85 in Texas State and Long Island. So I think Baylor's defense gets tested a little bit again this season. Could I see improvement? Yes, because it's difficult to envision a Dave Aranda defense being that bad, but it's not like they brought in a ton of dudes. It's not like the position that was unsettled last season all of a sudden has like a bunch of surefire talent in the secondary. So I think we'll see incremental improvement, but probably not a ton.
Brad, home games are always nice when you only have to travel 4 times in a 12-game schedule, but at the same juncture, will Baylor realize some of those benefits in terms of their win total, and what have you seen in that particular market?
I have taken an under position, under 7.5. There's still some 7.5s available. You got to pay a little bit of juice, but yeah, I was, immediately when a team drops off 5-6 wins from a year prior, I'm thinking, regression. But in this instance, I just don't see it with the parts and pieces, both offensively and defensively, in a very competitive conference where we mentioned this before we turned on the record button. I expect a ton of games in this conference to be decided by, one possession. And in that instance, I want to have the superior quarterback, and I don't like the Baylor quarterback, so under for me.
It makes a ton of sense. Look, there are going to be plenty of high-flying games. We have very capable offenses from top to bottom in the Big 12, so you're going to be able to want that quarterback that can go out there, make the big-time throw, and be able to turn a loss into a win in the waning seconds of a game. And a program that got some of that last year and kind of burst onto the scene was the Kansas Jayhawks. You look at Kansas this season, their win total sits at 6. You do have to go under at some shops. Long shots to win the conference, despite a lot of publications calling them a potential Cinderella story, widely available 50-1 or even upwards of 70 or greater. When you look at the Jayhawks, though, they'll return a boatload of offensive production, top 5 nationally. A lot of production on the defensive side. I'm not necessarily sure that's a good thing when you look at where Kansas finished last year, but they were good enough for 10th best in the nation in that particular department. Only FBS team last year that had a dubious distinction of being able to score 35 points per game and also allow 35 points per game. They did peak inside the AP poll at number 19 for the first time since 2009. However, it was a tale of two seasons. They started the campaign 5-0, go on to lose 7 of their final 8 games, including one of the more entertaining bowl games that we saw of the entire postseason. The 6 wins for the year, though, was more than the 5 that they'd had in the 3 previous seasons beforehand, and obviously Lance Leipold has Kansas fans believing that it's a general step in the right direction when you play in your first bowl game since 2008, snapping the longest drought in the FBS. Payne talked a little bit about the returning experience, and clearly last year this Kansas offense was at its absolute best when Jalen Daniels was 100%. He missed some time. The offense had a struggle for an identity. Jake Bean couldn't offer some of that dual threat ability that we saw, but a lot of reason to be excited when you look at some of the skill positions, both at the running back and receiver spot. The offensive line has an intriguing mix of talent there, but as far as offensive capabilities, can Kansas get back to the heights that we saw a season ago?
I think it's possible. Yeah. I mean, I'm sure a lot of our listeners who are entrenched in reading articles and listening to previews and buying magazines have heard all about that returning production you mentioned. 100% true. And it's the good kind of returning production. And Kansas was an offense that finished top 30 in schedule-adjusted EPA, top 25 in explosiveness, very good situationally in the green zone as well. I think the biggest thing returning for Kansas, though, is its offensive coordinator, Andy Kotelnicki. And, what the Jayhawks do schematically is so good. And I know it's something we emphasize on the NFL podcast about what makes a good OC. And it's always game planning to opponent and attacking opponent weakness rather than just throwing your arms up and saying we're going to do what we do, right? It's a lot of pre-snap motion. Kansas did a great job changing formations. They threw with play action. And to me, it was more of more scheme than talent there. The talent still is not great, but I thought Lance Leipold did a very good job smartly extending and giving Andy Kotelnicki a raise in January. I think he's going to be one of the hottest coordinator names this next offseason. Jalen Daniels, you mentioned, going to steer the ship again, dual threat. It's what made him number 1 in total QBR. When you look at, Power 5 quarterbacks in terms of EPA per play that included both runs and passes, Jalen Daniels was number 1. Extremely elusive in the pocket, had one of the very best pressure to sack rates. His play was a little swingy, though, right? The highs were super high, the lows were low. Needs to kind of work on being more consistent. It was good to also see more aggression. If you look year over year, Daniels' ADOT increased over a yard to 9.3. Really crushed it in the intermediate to deep middle of the field. I think your hope is the adjusted accuracy starts to accompany the added depth this season, because his adjusted accuracy dipped about 7% from 2021. You mentioned Jason Bean a little bit. I think Kansas got lucky to have him return as a nice backup. And, when you have a Daniels who's a mobile quarterback who can get injured, it's a really nice insurance policy with Bean, and it kind of raises the potential floor here to not having like a catastrophic step back season after you've gained all that momentum last year. Pass catchers have nice traits, right? Tall, long. You have Luke Grimm, averaged over 2.3 yards per route run, had just one drop on 79 targets. LJ Arnold averaged more than 2.1 yards per run. Fairchild is a really solid tight end, can line up in line and be a plus pass blocker, but also a threat in the pass game. So that allows, some deception in your formations. I think past Jalen Daniels being more accurate, the way Kansas makes a leap offensively is being more efficient when they run, right? Not calling more runs, but just being more efficient when you elect to run. Daniels and Bean, right? Their running abilities from the quarterback position actually skewed some of the run metrics, but specific to, a Devin Neal, solid back, right? Over 17% of his runs went for 10 plus yards. Kansas was able to hit some explosives, but down to down, they're outside the top 70 in rushing success rate. Part of that is the running back room. Part of it's the O-line not creating a ton of room on the ground. The O-line was outside the top 70 in line yards. I think the positive there is the O-line returns 4 or 5 starters. Word is those guys have bulked up this offseason in the weight room. Then, the Jayhawks go out and they land 2 from the portal, and Logan Brown and Spencer Laval. Logan Brown is going to start at left tackle. His last 270 snaps at Wisconsin, he graded out as 70, well above replacement level. It's a nice addition to the room. Spencer Laval either steals a guard spot because he's showing out here in fall, or he's a good depth piece. Schedule ticks up a notch, though, for this offense. Last season, if you look, the 11 FBS defenses Kansas faced had an average efficiency rank of 58th, according to our numbers. This season, we're projecting it into the mid-40s. In general, it just kind of feels like Kansas has some variance to them this season. You could enter the Texas game in late September 2-2, or you could enter 4-0 because we think BYU is really down this season and Illinois takes a step back. So I think those first 4 games are really, probably going to decide what the Jayhawk ceiling is this season.
It's a real question that obviously you're going to pay attention to, figuring out, which of Kansas's 2 seasons was the real Jayhawks, the group that started out like a house on fire, had College game day there, or a group that struggled late in the season. But obviously, if you're pointing fingers at where Kansas kind of went awry, it was on the defensive side, and Brian Borland going to be tasked with a very difficult job to get the most out of a group, even that brings back a high level of returning production. And they were the definition of a bend but don't break defense. Unfortunately for them, they broke a hell of a lot more than Jayhawks fans would want to see. And Brad, this was a group that allowed 35 plus points per game, 124th nationally, allowed 30 points or more 9 times, and fell off the map late in the season, finishing last in the Big 12 and 126 in the country, giving up 459 yards per game. The run D got absolutely obliterated over the final 4 games, giving up over 1,300 yards and 19 touchdowns. And when you look over the last 3 seasons of Kansas football, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out where they've been at their best. This is a program that's 8-1 when it allowed fewer than 175 yards. No, I'm not saying 75 yards, 175 yards, 8-1, 0-25 when that threshold was breached. Is there reason to be optimistic that Kansas can turn the corner and at least be closer to average instead of downright pitiful this season when you look at how their stop unit appears on paper?
No, believe it or not, I think there's some uncertainty, particularly when you're looking at that rush defense. I don't think, we talk about Kansas being number 1 in returning production. Literally everybody's back except one position group, defensive line, where they lose everybody. And, when I was rewatching some of Kansas's games last year just to show the disparity between the offense and defense, I circled 6 guys, the best players, guys that stand out, whether it's body types, lateral movement, production, whatnot. 5 of them were on offense, the 6 guys. And the only guy I circled on defense was Lonnie Phelps, and he's gone. He was their most disruptive pass rusher, 11.5 tackles for loss. He's gone. You mentioned a lot of the accounting stats. Some of the more analytical stats were just as bad. Number 123 in success rate allowed, number 126 in 3-and-out rate, number 108 in havoc rate. And I'm here to tell you, still, when you're comparing that to, some of the stats that they had in previous years, it's still, even that bad, it was still a little bit better than what they'd been in the previous 4 or 5 years. So I think they'll continue a little bit on the upward trajectory, but the main question will start on the defensive front. Losing all those guys led by Phelps, they went transfer portal heavy. They bring in a Colorado State kid, a 325-pound defensive tackle, ton of experience in Devin Phillips with 40 starts. They bring in a very talented kid in Dylan Brooks from Auburn. He'll be on the edge. He transfers in. Doesn't have a lot of snaps under his belt, though. Minnesota, they bring in a couple of transfers also on the defensive line from the Gophers. Austin Booker, Gage Keys. They do have a little bit of size. You would think, when they're getting run over for 286 yards per game in the last 7, games as far as rushing yards allowed, you would think, they don't have much size. Well, I mean, their projected starting tackles are going to be 310 and 325, so I like that at least on paper. Everybody's back in the back 7. Whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, I actually think it's a good thing, like Payne mentioned at the top. The veteran linebacker core, Rich Miller, Craig Young, they really like this Bowling Green transfer. J.B. Brown really impressed in the spring. As far as the secondary goes, leading tackler Kenny Logan's back. He was productive. I really like their cornerback, Kobe Bryant. He was a first-team All-Big 12 player, 12 passes defense for him. They bring in more transfers for added depth, an LSU kid in McGee. So I like it. I need to see it because, again, this has just not been the Achilles heel for Kansas. If we're charting the last 6-7 years, this has been the worst Power 5 defense in college football. So, and what they are offensively, I don't think it basically is, if you can hold it's a successful possession if you hold your opponent's field goal at this point. So, I'm kind of a wait and see. I'm much more optimistic on the offense.
All right, guys, I sit here and I process everything the two of you tell me because I obviously come in with my thought process, lean on you guys that do a ton of the heavy lifting. We like the offense. We like the coaching. We have plenty of questions defensively. So the open-ended question and logical follow-up from my perspective that I'll leave out there for both of you guys, what does it mean in relation to a win total that suggests Kansas is going to struggle with bowl eligibility with odds makers more or less throwing their hands up in the air going, this is a 500 football team?
I took under early number 6.5. I really like that. Now, and we get into this. We talked before we came on. There's 5 and it's down to 5.5 now. And again, I like the production coming back. I like the coaching staff. Do I take a little bit back at 5.5 if I don't have to lay too much juice? The answer to that eventually comes to be yes for me. Then is it all the way back and I just go for a straight middle? No, I only play maybe 20 or 30% back. So I'm kind of in between. This conference, again, there's going to be so many swing games. So I got a feeling I'm either going to be right on almost all of this or I could be wrong on a lot of stuff. And I think to protect myself, I'll play as long as the win totals move to win. I'll probably play back a little bit. This will be one, but I'm not going to go against as far as my strongest position. It's still going to be under 6.5 for me.
I would echo. Yeah, I would just echo Brad's sentiments there. It's like, when we're talking about these teams, the reason we're talking about them a little bit earlier is like the markets have adapted, right? They've completely adjusted. Stuff's getting released earlier and earlier as competition is out there in the marketplace for sports books. So it's like, at 6.5, Kansas might be one of our best bets on this podcast later on. Unfortunately, the market's 5.5 now, and it's a little bit of a different conversation, and I'm not looking to fade this coaching staff at 5.5. And, I think, I kind of asked Brad off air because he told me he bet every single win total in this conference. And I was like, at what point are you going to come back knowing they, a vast majority of them, right, are playing each other and these win totals are only off half a game or a game? It's like there's so many swing games. And I think that's, just peeling back behind the curtain. It's why I think Brad is going to play a lot of these back that have moved, a game in this instance specific to Kansas.
Now, full disclosure there, you could ask Brad that question about almost any conference, and he would tell you that he bet nearly every win total. So the Big 12 isn't an isolated anomaly in that particular regard. Let's be honest here, boys. But when we look at Kansas, obviously they represent one half of the Sunflower Showdown every year, and it was their in-state rival, Kansas State, that actually ended up atop the heap as conference champions. I know a lot of people fail to realize that when TCU is the team that made it to the college football playoff. When we look at Chris Kleiman's numbers coming into the year, Kansas State projected right around 8 wins. They find themselves a shade less than 7-1 to win the conference. And Chris Kleiman was rewarded with a significant 8-year deal for $44 million, allowing him to make a commitment to the program and the program to him as well. And I thought he had some interesting things to say about that. He says, what we've been able to accomplish in our first 4 years here is due to the culture that our players and staff have been able to create. I'm excited to continue to lead this football program and put a product on the field each year that can compete at the highest level. We haven't always seen coaches that achieved a high level of success at the FCS level be able to replicate that in the FBS. Kleiman has been able to do that. No spring game yet again for Kansas State, so I know that didn't exactly make Brad happy to get a first glimpse of Purple Power during March and April. When you look at the departure of Texas and Oklahoma, we kind of teased this at the top. You know, this is a Kansas State program that will have the most Big 12 titles of any of the remaining members. They won their first outright title in the league back in 2003, but they haven't won back-to-back league titles since 1909 and 1910. Won 10-plus games for the first time since 2012. Won 7 conference games for the first time since 2014. When you look at their schedule, 4 conference road games, 1 actually in-state at Kansas, an interesting early slate, which will give us a good litmus test of where Kansas State is. They'll at home against Group of 5 member Troy. They're at Missouri. They did bury the Tigers a season ago in a game that, if you dig into the stats, not exactly indicative. And they'll take on UCF early on in the Knights' Big 12 tenure. So when we look at this Kansas State team, Brad, obviously offensively they went through a change of identity. It was Adrian Martinez given the keys to the car early on. Will Howard stepped in, and all signs point to him assuming those reins going into this year. Threw for a little more than 1,600 yards and 15 touchdowns with only 4 picks. But this is a quarterback who enters his senior season with only 15 career starts under his belt, 7-8 record-wise, but he was 4-1 last year. Running back room, dynamic changes with no Deuce Vaughn, and so many questions for Kansas State, knowing they're going to have a giant target on their back in the 2023 season.
So let me talk overall overarching program, because I was there on the campus last summer, and I'm not sure I'll be able to be in Manhattan, Kansas too many times in my lifetime. I will say this, a lot of times these, campus tours, I'm looking for like infrastructure, investments, and I got to tell you, when you look at the stadium, you look at they're building a huge indoor practice facility. To me, it felt like this program wants to be top 25 consistently. It just felt that way to me. It looked that way. And then obviously they went out, and this was in the summer, and they went out and ended up winning the Big 12 championship to further bolster, their prospects moving forward. And speaking of prospects, I mean, their recruiting class for Kansas State, they were the number 32 class, best finish for them in nearly 2 decades. They signed 3 4-star players. Doesn't sound like much, but that's more than what Kansas State signed in the previous 12 classes combined. 3 4-star players. So there's been an uptick already. As far as the offense goes, you mentioned Will Howard. I think you got at least an early peek to this year with him starting, those last 4 or 5 games a season ago. You got to like the size, 6'5", 242. I thought he performed well, and I'm not a huge fan of him, but it seems to me when you read the tea leaves from the coaching staff and a lot of the people involved there, that I think they're bigger fans of him than at least I am on the outside. You look at some of the basic counting stats. I mean, without him, Kansas State averaged 5.7 yards per play, 28.4 points per game. With Howard in the starting lineup, 6.1 yards per play, about a half yard per play more, 36 points per game, so 8 points per game more on average. Had he qualified, when you looked at his stats and played enough games, he'd have been 10th in the nation in total QBR. So I guess diving into it, maybe he was a little bit more productive than at least my eye test showed. The one thing, it's going to hurt him. And I think that, one of the main storylines for this entire team, not just the offense, is Deuce Vaughn's not back there. You're talking about a guy that had nearly 2,000 yards from scrimmage. He's been their best player on offense the last several seasons. The one quote I read in one of the preview magazines was, Deuce Vaughn was more important to them than Bijan Robinson was to Texas. So, that's the type of player there that's, one of your all-time greats. So the main reason I've downgraded Kansas State's offense starts with Deuce Vaughn. And even Chris Kleiman mentioned you can't replace him with one guy. You need multiple guys. Lucky for Kansas State. Do they have a guy that's going to be as dynamic as Deuce? No, but they got a couple guys that I think can be solid, starting with Giddens, the running back that I thought looked good in the bowl game. He had 500-plus rushing yards a year ago, playing the backup role to Deuce Vaughn. And then, Payne can maybe touch on this a little bit. They bring in a solid transfer from Florida State, Trayshawn Ward, a guy that was productive, 600-plus yards last year. And look, I would be a little bit nervous if he had to be the bell cow. He never was the bell cow at Florida State, but he doesn't have to be here. So he'll be splitting reps like he's accustomed to. The one thing, some of their younger guys even got more reps in the spring because neither Giddens or Ward played in the spring. Another reason why I downgraded the offense a little bit is Malik Knowles, I thought, was by far their best wide receiver. He's gone, so that's a question mark with me. And I'm not sure that they got a go-to guy back. Phillip Brooks is back. They bring in an Iowa transfer, Keegan Johnson. If there is a go-to guy in the receiving game, it might be Ben Sinnott, their tight end. I think he's one of the top tight ends in college football. So I would expect him to get, maybe he gets a little bit more coverage from the defense side of the ball, opens up maybe one of those wide receivers to perform. The most positive thing I could think of the offense, though, is the offensive line. This feels like it can be an offensive line-driven program. And you got a guy in Cooper Beebe who's back, 6'4", 332, All-American caliber, not just all Big 12, but All-American caliber. And we're talking about a guy that suffered 5 blown blocks in 14 games per Sports Info Solutions. That's incredible. The center and left tackle are all conference caliber. So even without Deuce Vaughn, even without Malik Knowles, I mean, it's a slight downgrade. I forgot to mention this. I think maybe the biggest retention was Colin Klein, the offensive coordinator, flirted with the Notre Dame job. The ability for him to stay home there in Manhattan, I think, was a big coup for Kleiman.
Yeah, who knew that Manhattan is a little bit more of an exciting destination than South Bend? Anyone who spent quality time after 9 p.m. in either of those cities realize it. You mentioned the infrastructure for Kansas State, Brad. I think it's so important for a program like this that's essentially 2 hours from its closest major city that you need to have the facilities that you're bringing kids on campus. They have to be looking for that kind of dynamic and atmosphere. And clearly Chris Kleiman has recruited the kind of culture and athlete been able to replicate the process that made him so successful as head coach in North Dakota State up there in Fargo. But if Kansas State's going to have success, Payne, it's not just going to be because what this team can do offensively. Last year on the defensive side, they held opponents to less than 22 points per game, but they have to replace a ton of talent, specifically in the defensive backfield, which could always be problematic in a pass-happy league. But there is reason for optimism at some of the other position groups. That being said, the biggest absence will be an elite pass rusher in the Big Cat that they essentially lost up front, who gets drafted into the NFL.
What's so interesting about Kansas State is they are the perennial overachiever, and it's all of the things that you said, right? It's this coaching staff. It's giving them the benefit of the doubt because they're fantastic identifying guys for their system and developing them. And now, as Brad alluded to, they're getting more talent on top of that. But there is some concern defensively for me, right? Less than 50% of production returns. That's outside the top 100 in the country. You mentioned King Felix on the edge from their 3-down front, registered more than a 12% pressure rate on pass rush snaps. He was a plus run defender. He was a plus edge in coverage when they put him out there. K-State, wasn't a defense that generated much havoc at all. So, huge loss. Eli Huggins played 630 snaps at nose tackle. Not a guy that's going to get a lot of buzz, but, monster number for a 300-pound interior lineman. He graded out K-State's best defender last season. He's gone. And you look at what they're kind of doing to fix the end situation. It's like we're going to move, Khalid Duke from linebacker down to end. You do get Mott returning at the other end position, had 40 pressures last season. Nate Matlack will be in the rotation. The staff is really high on the redshirt freshman Donovan Ryman. You have Sumalo, someone the staff also loves, played less than 100 snaps last season, but they were great snaps, right? He's going to rotate at the tackle position. And then you have Javon Banks, who transfers in from Mississippi State. Banks is a replacement level player. So I think K-State really needs Sumalo to be the guy on the inside for there not to be, a drop-off inside. But the D-line has some serious question marks. Linebacker, Best position group on the defense. Really love Austin Moore. He's an absolute horse. Played all 14 games last season and over 800 snaps. He was a plus run defender. He was a plus coverage backer. Then Daniel Green surprised everyone and returned. I don't value him as much. He's a replacement level player. Clifton is the kid that's a little bit undersized, but the staff thinks that he is just a budding superstar. K-State also brought in 2 top 40 players from the 23 JUCO class. Both are linebackers, and Terry Kirksey and Rex Van Wy. Past the edge pressure. Secondary, probably the biggest concern for K-State. Not much production to speak of. You see K-State really value the safety position in their system, so they start 3 safeties that can act as undersized linebackers while also helping in coverage. Kobe Savage is back at safety. Was a JUCO guy that K-State snagged in the 2022 class. He can lay the wood, right? Also had 3 picks last season. But in totality, right, graded out a below replacement level player. He had surgery on November 28th to repair his ACL and meniscus. Then you have VJ Payne, right? Going to be the second safety. Played over 300 snaps as a freshman. He was a plus player. So I think he kind of, takes on that role and improves a little bit. Marquise Seigel transfers in from North Dakota State to play that third safety spot, more of a coverage role. He was elite in coverage at the FCS level. Last 225 coverage snaps graded out in 86. Always questionable if that's going to translate to the Big 12 level, but we'll see. Corner is the question mark. Clanderman likes playing tight coverage. That's why K-State was top 25 defense in passing success rate. They did give up an occasional explosive because they like to play aggressive, but you look at who's moved on, right? Julius Brents, NFL guy, 44th overall pick, skyrocketed up draft boards because he's 6'3", can move, has super long arms. I think he's going to be impossible to replace. Only allowed a 46% catch rate when targeted, 7 combined interceptions and PBUs. Ekabodoy is on an NFL roster as well. I think he's going to be replaceable. You have Jacob Parrish, who played over 300 snaps as a true freshman. If you listen to Colin Klein, he compared him to Terrence Newman.
Bold
only
praise.
allowed
Bold praise.
Allowed a 43% reception rate on targets. Will Lee transfers in from JUCO Iowa Western, long physical corner. I thought he looked more like a safety. Alabama made a strong push for him, and if Alabama's pushing for a secondary guy, I think it was safety that was the position of concern for them. Jordan Wright is in the mix to play significant snaps. Then in late April, Tyler Naomi from Southeast Missouri State transferred in, graded out well above replacement level in his 600 snaps there. He's in the mix. But, you just look at this defense, it just feels like end pressure and corner play are kind of the overarching questions. Clearly going to be, in my mind, some regression when you lose that much good production, and you're also fighting luck regression on top of that. K-State was top 10 defensively in turnover luck. The lone saving grace here is passing schedule and quarterbacks. We only project Texas and Kansas to have top 25 passing offenses. The other, solid offenses K-State has to play, but you just kind of look. They avoid Oklahoma and Dylan Gabriel. We'll talk about Oklahoma State's quarterback position soon enough. You have John Rice Plumlee and Tyler Shuck. They're not really striking fear into defenses as throwers. Houston, right, has a QB battle. One of those quarterbacks in the battle is Donovan Smith, who couldn't beat out Tyler Shuck. Iowa State's quarterback room, we'll call it unsettled right now.
Very diplomatic way to put it.
Missouri has question marks at quarterback, and I was reading an article that On3 published calling their QB plan heading into the season risky. So, maybe Kansas State's secondary can survive a touch better than we think because of the passing schedule. But, what kind of I'm hearing from Brad and kind of how you presented things, Todd, it's like a little bit of uncertainty because we always love to give this staff the benefit of the doubt, but you still see it in the market. We're now talking on July 5th. You can go over 7.5 minus 185. You can go under 8.5 minus 120. So, as our listeners are hearing this back in their head and thinking like, these guys are a little bit unsettled on Kansas State. It's like, yeah, we're not quite sure of the production returning and the talent, but we love the coaching staff so much, and kind of the market's telling you, hey, there's some waffling going on here on what's kind of believed to be Kansas State's 2023 season.
Yeah, this is typically a program when their stock is at the bottom, you buy low, knowing that they're going to be able to maximize the potential talent they have on the roster, but looking them to perform at a high level on a week in, week out standpoint. Look, it's always challenging. The Kansas State will need to get to 9 wins just for you to be able to cash that win total, unless you went over that 7.5 price tag that I know was a little bit better in the market than what it currently is here in early July. But gentlemen, if Kansas State was one of the biggest success stories last year in the Big 12, there had to be a major disappointment, and that disappointment happened to call Norman, Oklahoma home. When we look at the Oklahoma Sooners, their win total 9.5 shaded to the under, a shade more than 3-1 to be conference champions this year. And when you look at Brett Venables' report card, Oklahoma's done exceptionally well so far this offseason, ranked 4th in 24/7 Sports 2023 recruiting rankings behind only Alabama, Georgia, and Texas. One of the top 20 ranked NIL collectives with a merger of their two biggest outfits who didn't appear to be pulling in the same direction. And last year, while the record wasn't exactly great, they lost 5 games by 1 score. The Sooners are obviously due for a little bit better luck this year, but it's the first time the program finished below 500 since 1998. Lost 7 of their final 10 games after starting 3-0. Most losses in a season since they went 4-8 back in 1997, and suffered the largest loss in program history against their Red River rivals in the Texas Longhorns. The Sooners had won 6 straight league titles before back-to-back failures to even appear in the title game. Finished 3-6 in the league last year. Were 54-8 from 2015 to 2021. So a little to say, it's only 1 year of down performance, but the locals get a bit restless. And Brad, the offense was interesting, and I use that term interesting because it's rather vague, obviously. When you look at what they did from a scoring standpoint, it was down. Worst offensive season since 2013 at only 32.8 points per game. But when you look at the raw yardage, it was actually better in that department than what we saw in 2021. Jeff Lebby has his hands full, but fortunately for him, he's got a returning quarterback, and we did see flashes when Dylan Gabriel was healthy of how explosive this Oklahoma Sooners offense could be.
Yeah, you mentioned some of the basic counting stats. Didn't look like they missed too much of a beat losing a Lincoln Riley and a Caleb Williams. Number 13 in total offense, number 10 in rushing offense. But you mentioned there was a drop-off. It was in the scoring. Dylan Gabriel at quarterback, rewatching a few of their games, his overarching stats look okay. 25 touchdowns, 6 interceptions. He gave him, I think, a little bit more of a run threat than what was, initially expected out of him, with 300-plus yards there, 6 touchdowns. But had some consistency issues, accuracy issues, I would say, down the field, and a little bit when the coverage is tightened up in the red zone, it left a little bit to be desired for Oklahoma. Big reason, scoring touchdowns instead of field goals would have probably helped them in those one-score games where they were 0-5 last year. Jeff Lebby, the offense coordinator, says he's expecting more consistency this year out of Gabriel. And the good thing for Oklahoma is, unlike last season when Gabriel got banged up a little bit, that they have a legitimate backup quarterback. I know he's just a true freshman, but he's a 5-star in Jackson Arnold waiting in the wings, and I don't expect them to be playing Wildcat quarterback if Gabriel gets banged up a little bit like they were doing TCU and Texas. So that's a positive. What isn't a positive, though, a lot of the other positions, there was a lot of really good talent that Oklahoma had on offense. Don't believe me, they lost 5 guys to the NFL draft. The tackle, Anton Harrison, goes in the first round. Wide receiver Marvin Mims, when you look at an explosive big play type of guy, 20-plus yards per catch. You look at the more analytical stuff, Marvin Mims averaged 2.7 yards per route. That's elite. Next closest on Oklahoma was Farouk at 1.1 yards per route. Stoops was a pathetic less than a yard per route. He's more of a slot receiver, dependable guy who'll catch it but can't beat you over the top. That just to show you that Oklahoma's looking for some big play threats. Then they went out and got a couple of transfers. Well, whether it's Andrell Anthony from Michigan or Brennan Thompson from Texas at wide receiver, one of those guys has to step up and be that deep threat for them. The Varuk kid I did mention, I think he's solid. He can play. He's very versatile, not only a receiver. I mean, you can line him up in the backfield if you need to. Again, he was one of those guys playing wildcat quarterback in a couple of those games. The one thing, if you want to, and we talked about this before we hit record, was if you want to be positive about Oklahoma, I thought we got a little bit of a sneak peek on what this year's team can be in the bowl game. Because if you remember back to that bowl game, unfortunately for me, I was back in Florida State, and this
Makes
podcast
three of
was
us, Brad.
Yeah, this podcast was back in Florida State. First half, full game. I laid 7. I think it closed. Or no, I laid 6.5, and it closed 10. And man, I thought it was going to be an outright loser. And it was mainly because this Oklahoma offense, down a pair of tackles, 2 guys that ended up going in the first 3 rounds of the draft, performed quite well. And the backup running backs, you lose a guy like Eric Gray, super productive, 1,300 plus yards, 11 touchdowns. And what do they have? They have a couple of young freshman running backs that didn't miss a beat. In fact, both of them went over 100 yards in that game against Payne Seminoles. I mean, Javonte, and they looked the part, too. I don't think there was anything fluky too much about it. I mean, Barnes was more productive throughout the course of the season. Sawchuk, very highly rated kid coming out of high school. He looked solid. So I don't think they missed a beat there at running back. If there's some other concerns that I have, we'll start on the offensive line. Competitive depth, a lot of guys transferred out, and not even necessarily guys that you would think starters, but some of their competitive backups transferred out of the program. They bring in Walter Rouse to be their left tackle starter. He's from Stanford, 39 career starts. The Schaefer kid at guard, maybe he grabs a spot. He has 36 career starts. He's from Miami, Ohio, Caleb Schaefer. I like the 4-star true freshman. I think he might be getting some extensive playing time this year. If you listen to Venables, he thought he was one of the more impressive freshmen that they had at offensive tackle. So that, the offensive line's a little bit of a concern. Tight end, you lose a kid like Willis, another guy that got drafted. They bring back Austin Stogner. He's back for a second go-around here at Oklahoma after spending last season at South Carolina. So there's some good pieces here, and I like Jeff Lebby overall. I think Dylan Gabriel's solid. Is it as good as what we saw from Oklahoma offensively under Baker Mayfield and some of those other high-powered Lincoln Riley offenses? No, but I think it could be relatively close to last year, and I'll leave Payne talking about the defense. If they're going to make hay and be a much better team, I think it goes on the defense side of the ball.
One thing, Brad, before we get to Payne on the defensive side of the ball, when you look at Oklahoma's schedule this season, that has to provide some level of optimism, arguably one of the softest in the Big 12 from top to bottom, especially when you factor in a non-conference schedule now that includes 3 Group of 5 opponents rather than no Power 5 additions.
Yeah, I mean, right, I'm pretty confident, and I think Oklahoma's going to be favored in 11 of their 12 games, the exception being against Texas. Problem is, they were also favored last year in 11 of their 12 regular season games and still found a way to go 6-6. So that's certainly, when I watched that bowl game, I was stunned. I mean, that was 5-6 starters out for Oklahoma. And I just was stunned at their ability, their backups' ability to look at that talent on that team. To me, I know there was a bunch of close losses there, but that to me, and there was some sloppiness. I watched the Kansas State game. Just from, I don't know if you blame it on just a guy being a first-time coach, or maybe I hate doing this, just 1 year sample size, but maybe Venables is over his head. That's how bad. I mean, when you look at the talent level, that was just so. It just can't happen at 6-6 with that talent level. Can't happen.
Payne, Brad mentions a first-year head coach, and you're the first one to say if a coach can't go out there and get his team to perform with his fingerprints all over it based on his DNA, it's always a little bit problematic. And when we look at Oklahoma, or Brent Venables, I should say, Clemson had the number 1 scoring defense in the FBS over Venables' final 5 seasons, giving up a shade less than 15 points per game from 2017 to 2021. Fast forward to last year, Oklahoma had the number 99 scoring defense in the FBS, allowing 30 points per contest, allowed 30 points per game, and finished 122nd in total defense, which ain't exactly great by any stretch of the imagination. There weren't enough sacks, but when you look at what the defense was able to do, they did crank up 104 tackles for loss with plays coming from everywhere. And Venables was pretty open about changing the defensive identity. He said, we got bullied around and beat up too much. We've got to get better, the coaches and players. And the one thing, when you read some of the comments from their beat writers and those close to the program as far as spring takeaway, they said that the players looked more confident out there and they played faster. They said there was edge pressure, which was somewhat evident, and defensive backs were making plays on the ball in the air. But that's a defensive backfield that appears rather thin and has a lot of inexperience, where they're expecting big things from young players potentially early on in the season.
Man, there is a million ways I could go with this, but I'm going to kind of just stay focused and hone in on the defense. But to your point, Todd, it regressed last season under Brent Venables and Ted Roof. Our metrics had OU just outside the top 50 in 2021, barely inside the top 60 last season when you adjust for schedule. I think that was a huge shock because, we all value Venables and think he's one of the most, respected defensive minds in college football over the last decade. But we always wondered in the back of our mind, it's like, I understand Clemson continues to compensate him and make him one of the highest paid assistants, but like, when is this guy going to go on his own? Does he have the confidence to do that? And it just felt like maybe Oklahoma, since there was prior ties there, was like, if you're not taking this job, when are you ever taking one? So I do feel some type of reservation like Brad, but when you look at what he's recruiting on the defensive side of the ball, I think he's going to be just fine. In terms of, the assessment of the FSU performance, I think, especially early on in that game, yards didn't quite equal points, but we didn't view that performance as great as everyone else because of the situation. And I think we talk a little bit off air about this, like, metrics are great, models are great, but, we're not full robot yet. And, manual tweaks are needed. And I always use the example about the computer group, like selling off decades ago, and the buyers were never able to replicate the same success or maintain success to the middle and latter parts of each season because they weren't capable of the manual inputs and adjustments that were needed for the computer, right? So my point is, like, Brent Venables had 30 plus days to prepare for a Mike Norvell offense he had seen and prepared for multiple times at Clemson, and he was able to study a late season data point from Clemson against FSU where he knew every scheme and every player strength because he recruited those guys and he knew what their deficiencies were, and he was able to watch that film and apply it to his Oklahoma defense because he knew what his guys could do, right? He knew which guys could mimic some of those things. So I thought, many thought the Sooners defense, exceeded expectation in that game. I didn't. Offensively, something we had talked about for Oklahoma specific to their counterpart in Florida State, like, we weren't sure Florida State secondary was very good, and the first time they saw a quarterback and some tempo, all right, it really gave them some trouble. But kind of, focusing back in here defensively, it's like, Todd, you alluded to some change, and you saw that in the spring game. They went in a little bit more of a 4-down front look. Venables claims he's still going to mix in some 3-3-3 looks against pass-happy teams, but we're projecting more traditional 4-down fronts this season. Lots of portal use defensively. There's more talent. There's more competition, especially along the D-line. You look at the interior of the unit. It was really weak last season, outside the top 60 in defensive line yards, so it mirrors exactly what you both said about getting bullied up front. But you got 6 guys now in that rotation with Devin Sears, Isaiah Coe, Jordan Kelly, Jacob Lacey, and then the star of the spring game, Grayson Halton. Then you go out in the portal, and Venables adds Dejon Terry from Tennessee, a plus rotational interior lineman. There's just lots of bodies there now. At end, you have Ethan Downs, who graded out the best returning defender OU has. He created a pressure or a run stop on 10% of snaps. Needs to tackle better. The shocking part of spring ball, R. Mason Thomas got burned as a true freshman, suddenly showed up 17 pounds heavier to spring camp, and he maintained his burst. I am hearing that he's likely the game 1 starter. You have Rondell Bathroyd, who can play outside on early downs, kick inside in clear pass rush situations. PJ Adebere is all the rave, right? True freshman, number 2 edge player in the 23 class. I think he contributes year 1. If you watch him, boy, it's like cat quick with great get off. He's got bend. He's got flexibility. Trace Ford transfers in from Oklahoma State. Supposedly had a monster spring. And then you still have Reggie Grimes and Marcus Hicks. But what I am hearing is you're going to see a lot of Downs and Bathroyd on early downs, and then Adebare and R. Mason Thomas on third downs and in known pass rush situations. Linebacker production, I think, improves this season simply based on depth, right? OU played their top 3 backers 900-plus snaps last season. Guys got worn down. It's what happens when your offense goes 309 miles per hour. You got Danny Stutzman, who played almost 1,000 snaps. He's back. Production, I think, is better in year 3. Then you have Jaron Kanik, who is a high 4-star player, was the 5th best athlete in the 2022 class. He's slated to start, played as a true freshman. Freakishly athletic and fast, was great in coverage. Then you have Deshaun McCullough, supposedly going to take over the cheetah position. 4-star transfer from Indiana. He was the 19th best portal player this class, graded out above replacement level as a true freshman. I think he's only scratching the surface. You mentioned the secondary, Todd. I think that's interesting. Certainly trying to build confidence in that group. You have Woody Washington returning for what feels like year 19. Played 900 snaps himself. He graded out OU's best corner. It was his best season. Jaden Davis transferred to Miami. CJ Colden is with the Vikings now. So you go out in the portal and hit the JUCO ranks this time. Kendall Dolby, a 4-star JUCO transfer, was the #1 JUCO corner. I think he is the day 1 starter. There isn't some huge transition because Dolby played JUCO ball in Oklahoma. Past those 2, there are depth concerns. It's all unproven players like Walker, Williams, and Rowe. It sounds like 4-star freshman Josiah Wagoneer was all the Ravens spring and summer. He was an early enrollee, so that probably helps, possibly contributes year 1. Billy Bowman is a fantastic cover safety, and then you have Peyton Bowen, a highly thought-of freshman safety who could contribute right away. Overall, I do see this defense making a massive year 2 leap from barely inside the top 60 to possibly in the 30s. But they're going to have to stay healthy in the secondary because there's not much depth. Similar to Kansas State, though, only Texas and Kansas are projected top 25 passing offenses on Oklahoma's schedule. So I do see a big uptick defensively for this unit. But I think what's interesting here, guys, and, some professional bettors are super high in Oklahoma this season, partly because of the softer schedule. Others are still kind of in wait-and-see mode. But, I like the overall philosophy here, right? Brent Venables says to himself, like, hey, I'm a great defensive mind. I trust that aspect of my game, right? And I'm going to recruit the shit out of the defensive side of the ball, which we're seeing already, especially with the 2024 class. And I'm going to be the motivator, right? And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring in a well-respected offensive mind, and I'm just not going to fuck with him. I'm going to let him do his thing. Just go. But it feels like sometimes, at least in year 1, the right hand wasn't communicating with the left hand, right? It's like, I like Jeff Lebby's offense, right? I really do. But like you had depth issues on defense, you're still going 309 miles per hour. It feels a little gimmicky too, right? We're stretching our wide receivers out past the hash marks. Like, it's a good college offense. It works at this level, but it's gimmicky. And then you just think about the composition of this team. Like, one of the best offensive recruiters on Oklahoma staff is its running backs coach. And then you have a defensive-minded head coach. And so it's just like something feels a touch off. So it's very much wait and see for me. But, the schedule is so soft, relatively speaking. Like, you could see Oklahoma, right, make the Big 12 championship game and then pull off a 1-game upset, and then it's off to the races for Oklahoma as they start to make that SEC money, and you're just going to see the recruiting, especially on the defensive side of the ball, just elevate to a level that hasn't been seen at Oklahoma in recent years.
A massive season, no doubt, for Oklahoma, because everything sets up for them to compete for a conference title. If they're unable to even get to the championship game, some of that energy and enthusiasm about moving into a much tougher zip code in the SEC will subside, and you begin to wonder how long it takes the Buzzards to keep from circling around Brent Venables, who's only gone through 1 season. So we'll monitor Oklahoma and figure out what this program looks like. Encourage all of you guys and girls out there to follow the talented trio of handicappers we have on this fine show. You can follow Payne on Twitter at Payne Insider. You can follow Brad Powers there as well at Brad Powers 7. I'm Todd Fuhrman. Follow me on social media, but most importantly, follow Bet the Board Pod for all things things Bet the Board, not only for college football previews that are winding down, but also the NFL that loom on the horizon in early August, a little bit of sports memorabilia talk with Cardboard Chat, and of course our NASCAR podcast in Stay Green. And gentlemen, you can only have Bedlam if you have two dance partners, and this may be the final season that we see the annual showdown between Oklahoma and Oklahoma State. When you look at the Cowboys win total, 6.5, heavily shaded to the under at a lot of shops, 50-1 long shots to end up atop the heap in the conference. And Mike Gundy will enter his 19th season in Stillwater. It was his fewest wins since 2018, where he also went 7-6 last year. It was a 5-game drop-off year over year. However, he was able to continue a streak of 17 straight winning seasons. Only Boise State and Wisconsin have longer such active streaks right now. No losing seasons for Gundy since his first year in Stillwater back in 2005. 6 double-digit win campaigns, 5 top 15 finishes. But 2011 was the only Big 12 championship season. They came up, obviously, about 6 inches short 2 years ago of maybe even getting into the college football playoff. And when you look at the way things unfolded for the Cowboys last year, 6-1, averaging nearly 45 points per game in the first 7 games, and that was before the wheels completely fell off when they limped to the finish, going 1-5, averaging just more than 14 points per contest over their last 6, and most importantly for bettors, all 6 of those final games came in under the total. They'll play all 4 new Big 12 teams in a 5-game stretch to end their regular season. Big 12 road games, Iowa State, West Virginia, UCF, and Houston. So it's awfully interesting. But of course, Mike Gundy, not one to back away from firing a salvo. If we ever play Texas again, it'll be in a bowl game. This is the last go-round with OU. I guess we could play them in a bowl game when they're in the SEC. So it's going to be an adjustment for all of us. But Payne, Casey Dunn may have the biggest task of all, trying to figure out exactly what this Oklahoma State offense is going to look like, because erratic quarterback play last year doomed them, but they do bring in a familiar face, at least by Big 12 standards, that could potentially take over as QB1.
Yeah, I'm not quite sure what this offense is going to be either. You know, it's like we've heard whispers the past few years of internal issues at Oklahoma State, and that really is the only thing that makes sense for Spencer Sanders to leave in his final season of college football and transfer to a place that isn't guaranteeing him the starting job, right? Like there's something going on there, because it doesn't make sense, or he's looking at this like the Titanic and he's getting off the ship early, you know? When I look at Spencer Sanders, like he wasn't elite, but he was a fine college quarterback, and you could see him, you know, incrementally improving each year despite a really shoddy O-line. You look at the vast majority of Oklahoma State's rushing production the last couple seasons, it came from Spencer Sanders, right? Led the Pokes in EPA per rush the last 2 years, positive 0.41. I thought he was vital to Oklahoma State's offense, and I think that really became clear without analytics, right? He gets injured towards the end of the Texas game, tries gutting it out early against Kansas State before leaving. He misses the Kansas game entirely, and then Oklahoma State loses both those games in successive weeks by 69 points without Spencer Sanders. So you're wondering, it's like, whew, maybe he was, you know, holding this ship up a little bit here. You kind of hinted at Alan Bowman, third school, great kid. I know he is extremely focused on football now that he got his master's degree complete. It's a system Bowman's more comfortable with, right? When you're kind of doing some reading and getting some information, when he got to Michigan, he basically had 6 weeks. And all of a sudden he steps into an offense that's playing him under center, something he wasn't used to. And then he's talked about all of like the intricate footwork needed from the quarterback just to hand it off in Michigan's run schemes. But I go back to Bowman's first season. He was a freshman. He was in the shotgun. He was part of a pass-first system. He was really solid. 82% adjusted accuracy when he was kept clean. Did a very good job finding the open man and making defenses pay when blitzed. 134 passer rating when the heat was on. And then you look at him throwing to all levels of the field. Was a plus passer his freshman season to all 4 levels. So Oklahoma State loses, I think, some of the mobile component that Spencer Sanders brought, but I think the accuracy gets a little bit better from the quarterback position. I am interested to see what this looks like early, because there's some rumblings that, you know, since Bowman punctured his lung the second time from a hit, he's kind of got jelly in the pocket. We'll see. There's also some hype around the freshman Zane Flores. It does feel a little bit early for him, though. It just feels like Alan Bowman's job initially. And I think, you know, the question mark for me is like, what's around him? Oklahoma State's offensive line has been, a problem, as I alluded to, for multiple seasons, especially in pass protection. They're outside the top 90 in havoc allowed, pressure allowed, and sacks allowed last season. You listen to Mike Gundy, right? It's like all the offensive line adjectives are out in full force this season, right? It's like, we're going to be more mean. We're going to be nasty, right? We're going to be more physical. So word is he's changing some scheme stuff. He's changing blocking concepts. The vast majority of the starters are back with, I think, a couple upgrades potentially. You have 4-star Texas State transfer Dalton Cooper. He's in here. Plus pass blocker all 4 seasons for the Bobcats, graded out an 84 last season. He's allowed 7 sacks and nearly 1,500 pass block snaps in his career. Jason Brooks is in the lead for the left guard position, was a plus run blocker last season, very poor in pass protection, though. And then you have Joe Mikulski moving from guard to center. He's been replacement level as a guard the last 2 seasons, so we'll see what happens there. Preston Wilson kicks from center to guard. I think if you look at some of his metrics, if he can return to the 2020 and 2021 form, it'd be huge. Was a really good pass blocker both those seasons. Jake Springfield will remain at right tackle, had his best season last year in pass protection. Running back room was not very good last year, partly O-line, partly the backs. You look, all told, Oklahoma State was outside the top 100 in EPA per rush and success rate. Jaden Nixon and Ollie Gordon look like the 1-2 punch. Nixon was the star of the spring game. I think Gordon has a little bit more upside, though. Elijah Collins transfers in from Michigan State. They like him better than everyone else, it seems, but Oklahoma State needs more from the running back room. Receiver group, past Brennan Paisley, is a question mark. And you look at Paisley, right? He's kind of small. He's a slot guy, lines up there 95% of the time, did average 2 yards per route run. And then it's just like a mix of transfers and young guys that haven't really produced yet. Stribling and Bruce earned 4-star transfer grades, both coming off below replacement level seasons for Wazoo and Iowa. Jaden Bray, the redshirt sophomore, is all the talk this spring, making the case to be wide receiver 1. Hasn't been very good the first 2 seasons. Bryson Green is back, replacement level. Tight end room looks like one of the weakest in the Big 12. I kind of mentioned, the scheme shift in blocking and some offensive philosophy. So you kind of just look, right? The Pokes go with more inline blocking tight ends than pass catchers. It sounds bleak offensively. It really does. And it could be. But the schedule might be Oklahoma State's saving grace here. We're projecting the 12 defenses the Pokes face to have an average efficiency rank of 71st this season. Overall, you look, right, it's like, okay, starts with a directional Arkansas school. They avoid Texas. They get Arizona State early when, they're in transition mode. Iowa State early where, some suspensions could be prevalent. Nobody on earth has any idea what Neil Brown is doing. And then at the back end of the schedule, right, it's Cincinnati, Houston, and BYU. All 3 are down relative to last season for me. Pro bettors have gone under Oklahoma State at better numbers than current market, but the schedule is pretty soft here.
All right, if we have questions about Oklahoma State and how this group is going to look offensively, I think there are a bevy of them that we have on the defensive side of the ball as well. And Brad, that starts with their unconventional hire of a Division II defensive coordinator in Brian Nardo, who comes over from Gannon University. And when you listen to some of the quotes from Nardo, it's interesting. Talking about the transition and being given another opportunity to coach at a high level, he goes, it's the exact same job I've always done. I thought it would be something different, and it really hasn't been. Once you get past how big the players are, you realize they're still 18 to 23-year-old kids, and coaching is coaching, football is football. Well, unfortunately for Nardo, it's a little bit different when you take on the Oklahomas, the Texases of the world, the Cincinnatis, the UCF, compared to Westchester, Millersville, Clarion, Seton Hill, Edinboro, and the college football powerhouse known as Mercyhurst in Erie, Pennsylvania. But this was an Oklahoma State defense that saw a regression year over year. They were very good in 2021. Last year, they started to resemble more of those leaky stop units that we'd grown accustomed to in Stillwater in the past. But when you look at Oklahoma State defensively, they're not just changing defensive coordinators after Derek Mason takes a sabbatical, but there are a ton of new faces who are going to be asked to fill in pretty prominent roles right from the season opener.
Used a lot there. One of the key words, in my opinion, is regression, because there was a hell of a lot of it on this defense a year ago. Just basic counting stats, allowed 11 points per game more, yards per game, 140 nearly yards per game more. Really, the rush defense really was horrific compared to what it was a year ago when you're allowing 2 yards per carry more on average and 90 yards per game more on average. That was a big time failure for them. They couldn't get pressure on the quarterback. Went from number 1 in the country in sacks in 2021 to just 26 last year. Obviously, the guy that was most responsible for that defensive production was the DC, Jim Knowles, who took the Ohio State job last year. You bring in a guy that has a ton of experience in Derek Mason, and it was just a failure. And it's a one and done. And now you're on your third different DC in 3 years. You're switching up schemes. You're going to go to a 3-3-5 scheme here under Nardo. I think it makes sense considering the offenses you face in the Big 12, and obviously the most impressive defense statistically over the last 5-6 years runs a 3-3-5, that being Iowa State. So I get it from that aspect, but man, when I look at the personnel, I just don't see it. I mean, you're talking about an Oklahoma State defense. I get it wasn't good a year ago, but all those guys you would hope that coming back and maybe they'll improve. Most of them are gone. They lose 8 of their top 10 tacklers. They lost a couple of kids in the NFL draft. A couple of their best players transferred out, including Mason Cobb, transferred to USC. He'll probably be one of USC's best defenders, so that was a significant loss there. You look at what they have come in. I'll start with the recruiting class because we can talk this, program trajectory. I follow recruiting because a lot of times it's a leading indicator for what your program is going to be. I'm not sure that's a good look that you just signed your worst recruiting class in 20 years, this upcoming freshman class. So that's not a good look for Oklahoma State. They went transfer heavy, besides some position group changes. They bring in a couple of Tulsa transfers. Justin Wright's one at linebacker. Anthony Goodlow is a guy at defensive end. Very experienced players. Wright, 32 career starts, 250-plus tackles. Goodlow, 22 starts at Tulsa. They should help a little bit there, offset some of the returning losses. But I guess I'm more intrigued at some of the position changes, particularly on the defensive line. Obviously, moving to a 3-3-5, you need that big nose guard in the middle. They bring in a guy from Utah Tech, an FCS school. Justin Kirkland's his name. He's 6'4", 350. You got a major step up in competition. You can wonder, how many downs and snaps is he going to be able to go going from FCS to Power 5 football. So that'd be a concern there. The one guy I really liked last year up front, Colin Oliver, he was the edge guy. He moves to linebacker in the new scheme. So it'd be interesting to see if they can develop some pressure on the outside with him moving more to a linebacker role. He's a guy, Oliver, 16.5 sacks the last 2 years. I'm kind of stretching it here when you're looking at who they got. I mean, Xavier Benson is back at linebacker. He's okay when they're returning leading tacklers. On the back end, Kendall Daniels was a guy that was the Big 12 Defensive Freshman of the Year. He was good in run and pass. He had 13 run stops. He also had 5 PBUs, 3 interceptions. He had 37.4 QBR allowed. That's really good. He's going to change positions, though, in the new scheme. He's going to move to Rover. So I guess what I'm getting at is, my goodness, with all the position changes, with a question mark as far as returning production, with a question mark at coaching with being your third defensive coordinator in 3 years, a guy stepping up from Division II all the way up to the Power 5 level, I've actually downgraded Oklahoma State's defense even from last year's poor numbers. So that doesn't give a not necessarily good optimistic outlook for the team. But like Payne mentioned, saving grace is the schedule. No Texas, no TCU, no Baylor, no Texas Tech. For the better, overall power rating teams in the league. You're playing all the newcomers. 3 of them are at the bottom of the newcomers. I think we'll get a good idea early. 2 winnable road games, Arizona State, Iowa State, and neither one of those offenses, in my opinion, are going to be that great. So we'll get an early look and see if Oklahoma State can be better on defense. But right now, more questions than answers.
Such an interesting program. I mean, you mentioned some of the concerns recruiting-wise that Oklahoma State has dealt with, and obviously if you're not producing wins on the football field week in, week out, it's tough to maintain some of that momentum, and this is an Oklahoma State team that obviously should see opportunity in front of them in a newly revamped Big 12 if they're able to have a winning campaign this year and start to get that high-powered offense to look like we've grown accustomed to in the past. So it should be interesting to see what Coach Gundy's able to do. A little Texas three-step here, gentlemen, as we have a trio of Texas-based programs that we'll hit on all in a row. And we can start with the team that performed at the highest level last year, getting to the national championship before they were absolutely annihilated at the hands of the Georgia Bulldogs. And that, of course, is the TCU Horned Frogs, whose win total sits at 7.5, shaded to the over. They find themselves right around 15-1, 18-1 to win the conference this year. Sonny Dykes enters year 2. And Sonny Dykes pretty much said, nobody wants the honeymoon to be the best part of the marriage. He told reporters after spring practice, we've got to make sure that doesn't happen here. And this was a TCU team that addressed some of their needs with one of the best recruiting classes in program history. On the heels of tying for the most wins in school history, the first time the program went undefeated in conference play since 2011 as a member of the Mountain West Conference. They won 6 games against ranked opponents last year, reached the national title for the first time in school history, and had 8 players selected in the 2023 NFL Draft. Ironically enough, 3 of them ending up as members of the Los Angeles Chargers. When we broke down Clemson, we talked about how Garrett Riley was leaving TCU to take over the program down there. In steps Kendall Briles to assume the reins as the OC in Fort Worth this season. Potential exists to play a little bit faster and have more emphasis on the short, quick passing game. This was a group, though, Brad, that averaged 41.3 points per game in the regular season, good enough for 4th in the FBS. The Frogs, though, must replace 2 leading rushers, top 3 receivers, and a few key linemen to go along with the Heisman runner-up in Max Duggan. But for the casual fan out there, they may fail to realize that Duggan wasn't even the starting quarterback going into the Week 1 game last year against Colorado. It's Chandler Morris, and he's back in his return from injury.
So let me say this. I mean, I thought, considering you lose a guy like Garrett Riley, I thought Sonny Dykes did a really good job getting Briles from Arkansas. Off the field issues, they take that away. On the field, I think he's a good coordinator. You mentioned it. How's it going to be a little bit differently? Maybe a little bit more tempo, a little bit more in the quick pass game. At least watching the abbreviated spring game, they're using the tight ends more. They rotated a bunch of wide receivers on the first team in the spring game. And I got to tell you, even with all those losses, the offense dominated the spring game for TCU. But there's some significant losses, starting at quarterback and Max Duggan. I think they can actually be a little bit better, maybe in the pass game, in the short pass game, considering Chandler Morris, you mentioned, was the guy coming out of camp last year who was going to be the starter. He gets hurt in the Colorado game. And, one thing I do like, Doug, and I mean, from a leadership aspect, I mean, I don't know how to quantify it, but that will be a loss from a guy in the huddle and in the locker room. I'm just not sure that Chandler Morris can be that guy. And I'll mention this, at 6'1", 195, is he going to bring you a toughness as far as the quarterback run game that Max Duggan did? Probably not at that size. Good thing is they got a capable backup, in my opinion, Oregon State transfer Chance Nolan. He's got experience. You mentioned 2 leading rushers gone, top 3 receivers gone. Who's going to replace them? They went to the SEC, man, specifically Alabama for a lot of these transfers on the offense. Let's talk running back. Trey Sanders, a former 5-star kid, he's going to come in. He'll battle Amani Bailey at that running back position. Maybe a slight downgrade just because we haven't seen it yet from Trey Sanders, but man, you got to like the talent and the ability there. At wide receiver, JoJo Earl also comes in from Alabama. They bring in an LSU transfer and Jake Beck at tight end. The one guy that stood out to me, though, was an Oklahoma State transfer, J.P. Richardson. To me, was a spring game standout. I mean, he looked like wide receiver 1. I know it's just one game, one practice, but he looked exceptional in this offense. A guy that they really want to take the next step. He has the prototypical size. At least if you're comparing him to what they had in Quentin Johnston a year ago. Savion Williams, 6'5", 215, almost 400 receiving yards a year ago. Maybe he can take a step up this year. He doesn't necessarily have to be the guy, but he certainly has to be more productive. Offensive line, they were incredibly lucky as far as on the injury front a year ago. When you have the same offensive line start all 15 games together, they usually don't see that year after year. They lose 3 starters. On the positive side, they return both of their tackles. They bring in, sounds like a broken record, an Alabama transfer and Tommy Brockermeyer, another former 5-star they bring in on the offensive line for competitive depth. I do worry about the interior of the offensive line, losing all 3 guys there. But, obviously Dykes, is an offensive-driven coach, finds production no matter where he goes on that side of the ball. So even losing at a place like TCU, 5 NFL draft picks on one side of the ball, you certainly got to downgrade them, but I think other schools, I'd be downgrading them a little bit more significantly.
You know, a lot of optimism, it sounds like, from Brad Payne on what TCU can expect in their second year under Sonny Dykes' leadership. Defensively last year, it was very much a mixed bag. They seem to have a knack for coming up with a timely stop or making a clutch play when required. But eventually, when the dam broke against Georgia, we saw exactly what could happen. And Joe Gillespie, the defensive coordinator, led a defense that ranked only 95th nationally in total defense, 90th in scoring. When you look at the scoring defense, rushing defense, and sacks, though, it all improved year under year under Gillespie's leadership. That being said, they gave up 4 touchdowns or more in 9 games, were able to somehow go 7-2 in those contests, but did allow 141 total points in the final 3 games of the season. What do we expect for an encore from this team defensively, knowing that they lose one of their biggest difference maker in Hodges Tomlinson in that defensive backfield?
I thought Gillespie outperformed expectation in year 1 by a mile. Some of the counting stats were not so favorable, but I like the approach that he has with his defense. Right, it's an aggressive 3-3-5 where players are crashing down and fill holes and they fly around and create some havoc. And metrically, right, once you adjust for schedule, TCU's defense went from a fringe top 100 defense to a top 40 unit for us in one season, and now you got over 70% of the defensive production returning. But to your point, right, there's a couple of the horses are gone, and I think the defense after Brad's breakdown is going to be relied upon a little bit more in my mind this season. So you got to wonder how that shakes out. Hodges Tomlinson and Dylan Horton graded out 2 of TCU's top 3 defenders. Both were drafted. Hodges Tomlinson only allowed 34% of targets to be caught on 81 passes thrown his way. Horton was TCU's best front 7 player by a mile, recorded 80 pressures and run stops combined. Trell Cooper also gone, just a nice edge setter and a plus defender. Past those 3, everyone meaningful does return. To me, pressure is more scheme than player driven. There aren't many dudes on TCU's D-line that are getting to the quarterback. You look past Demonic Williams, the D-line has some questions. 600-plus snaps as a true freshman last year. He is all the rave. I think, he's fantastic, and they're moving Williams around more, I'm told, to create some edge pressure, so he's not going to just line up at nose tackle, but end as well. Caleb Fox is solid. Paul Oyewale is a redshirt freshman that really needs to step up. The 2 transfers taken in Tico Brown and Rick D'Abreu are Jags. I didn't see anything there, but they're probably scheme fits, right? It's a little bit of a quirky scheme. As you kind of go through the roster defensively, it just feels very much like some are greater than the parts in the front 7. Very scheme reliant. Linebacker group is just solid. Johnny Hodges is a good linebacker. You saw the transition from Navy to TCU. It went pretty well. Had his best season. He's a plus cover guy, tackles well. Jamoy Hodge improved to replacement level last season. Marcel Brooks is the former 5-star LSU commit, played less than 100 snaps last year, but graded out extremely well. I'd probably try to unlock that potential because there isn't that type of talent on defense. Obi Izor, replacement level. Shadrich Banks, replacement level. I like the secondary with Josh Newton. He's an elite cover corner, only allowed 35% of targets to be caught last season, did give up 5 touchdowns, but it tells you how good he was elsewhere because he only allowed a 56 passer rating when targeted. He was TCU's best defender. Channing Canada was the number 2 JUCO cornerback in the 23 class. He comes in. Avery Helm transfers in from Florida. A lot of people are hyping him. I don't know. He lost a bunch of snaps year over year to better talent. It's why he transferred out. Replacement level player in 3 seasons of sample in Gainesville. So, it's Canada and Helm basically battling it out for cornerback 2. That seems to be a little bit of my concern there. Bud Clark proved to be a damn good nickel last season, and a ton was put on his plate. Went from 124 snaps to 523 year over year. Had a 72 coverage grade. Huge pick 6 in the semifinal against Michigan. You have Millard Bradford is kind of the guy that interchanges with Bud Clark from safety to nickel. Bradford coming off his best season. Pretty good in run support. Mark Perry, a decent thumper at strong safety, had 28 run stops. What I am hearing, though, is guys are far more comfortable in year 2 of Gillespie's system, right? Again, 3-3-5, it's a little bit quirky. Guys are playing faster. There's less thinking. And for me, like, that has to be the case, right? Because the schedule of offenses is brutal. None of the 11 FBS offenses TCU faces are projected outside our top 80. On average, you're looking at 33rd in our efficiency projection. On average, each week is what TCU is going to face offensively. So a huge shift up in schedule difficulty for TCU's defense.
It's always interesting to see teams like this and how they handle a level of prosperity, because I don't want to diminish anything TCU was able to accomplish last year, but it felt like everything that could go right for the Horned Frogs did go right, and there was regression that just happened to come in one football game. Slammed into a 60-minute sample size when they ran into a Georgia juggernaut.
Georgia's just better.
Yeah, well, that's the whole thing.
That's not a good
look,
point in my mind, but yes.
Yeah, the bottom line was, look, TCU got away with a lot of things. Their defense showed some vulnerabilities, but I don't think there was any team in college football, maybe for the last 5 years, that beats Georgia the way Georgia played in that national championship game. But we'll see, obviously, if they're able to maintain that level of success. I know they start with a pretty favorable schedule against Colorado and Nichols, and then you guys talked about how much more difficult it gets as the season progresses. And if TCU is going to have some problems, you'd like to think that a team inside the same state obviously wants to get to where TCU was a season ago. And that, of course, is the Texas Longhorns, who see their win total listed at 9.5, shaded to the over. Texas is the prohibitive favorite right now at a shade better than even money when you shop around to win the Big 12 Conference. And this is Steve Sarkisian's 3rd season, so it's time where rubber meets the road. And continuity and depth are 2 words that we've heard thrown about a ton around this particular program. They did win 8 games in the regular season for the first time since 2018, going 9-3. 4 of their 5 losses came in one-score games, all against ranked opponents, and they outscored their opponents by 12.8 points per game in 22. It was actually the best point differential in the league. They haven't, however, won the league title since 2009. This is a Texas program who has elite recruiting. We know they brought in the number 1 quarterback recruit in Arch Manning, or number 1 overall recruit this past year. Quinn Ewers had that same billing in the past. And when you look at the way Texas has performed against its top rival, they've scored 48 points in 2021 and 49 points last year against Oklahoma. That's always going to leave Texas fans feeling warm and tingly, but you do need to get a conference championship. And Payne, if Texas is going to get there, so much of it has to revolve around Quinn Ewers taking the next step in his development. We know the quarterback's coach, A.J. Milieu, and Tashard Choice have played a huge role in the Longhorns' recruiting dominance. Can they get those results, though, to translate on the football field and allow Texas to flirt with a double-digit win campaign?
If I was talking about the defense, I would sound extremely optimistic. Because Pete Kwiatkowski is my guy. But I'm going to talk about Texas' offense probably like relative to the hype, right? And I think that's probably a good caveat to start.
Texas is back, baby. Texas is back.
As we talked about this off air, I would have thought I read a eulogy to you 2 gentlemen about the Longhorn offense. I think you'd be hard pressed to find a more talented offense in college football than what Texas is going to trot out this season. And, Sark is generally considered one of the better offensive minds, but I'm interested to see how this all kind of molds together. And you mentioned Quinn Ewers, Todd. It's all on him this season, right? Like, the arm talent is as good as it gets. Velocity, can throw from different platforms. He moves well within the pocket and can create out of structure. The highlight reel and tight window throws show up multiple times a game. But what we heard last offseason, right, it was like Ewers struggled in camp turning it over. And then all of a season, the season kicks off, and it's like we all got excited watching a 12-pass sample against Nick Saban and Alabama's defense.
Damn right we did.
And then the next time we see Ewers is for the Red River Shootout. He's got 0 pressure on him because Oklahoma's running Wildcat all game, and Texas wins in a landslide. But after those 2 data points, about a month apart, like just everyone's ready to anoint Ewers the second coming, and you just watch the season play out a little bit, and you start to dig into some of the metrics. Looking back, it's like Ewers had accuracy issues. They continued from fall camp and spring camp and summer camp, and 93 quarterbacks last season dropped back 300 plus times. Ewers was 78th in adjusted accuracy. Did start to play better the final 3 games above replacement level against Kansas and Baylor. Then had a damn good bowl performance against Washington. But those 3 defenses had one thing in common. They were all outside the top 90 in passing success rate allowed. So the verdict is still a little bit out on what Ewers truly is. Watch the spring game. It's like, okay, yeah, that's good. Right? It's just it's not, number 1 quarterback generational talent good. Maybe that unfolds, this season. Ultimately, like Ewers is going to have to play to a level that is substantially better than anything he did last season. He's going to have to be more consistent because I think the run game takes a step back. And you look at when Ewers and Sark and even Hudson Card, right, had to throw last season in known passing situations because, Bijan Robinson would get bottled up in certain situations. They couldn't. And I think Sark's going to put even more on Ewers' plate because he doesn't have Bijan Robinson. And I just, so I'm not talking out of both sides of my mouth. I think at the NFL level, most running backs are replaceable, right? And that's kind of how we view that position in 2023. It's just viewed as plug and play. I don't think that way at the college level as much, right? Like, not for a generational talent like Bijan. He was the best back in college football, extremely elusive, averaged 4.2 yards after first contact. You look at the explosive runs, nearly a 10% explosive run rate. Then you had Roschon Johnson, who would have been RB1 at like 99% of other schools, right? He averaged 4.3 yards after first contact. So to me, it's going to be running back by committee for Texas this year. You have Jaden Blue, solid spring. Savion Red is moving from receiver to tailback. He looked like he had some juice, big spring game for him. And then CJ Baxter, the 5-star freshman. You look at Blue and Red, for me, they have to be good enough early on to buy Baxter some time. Baxter is the true running back talent in this room, but he's got to get acclimated to the college level. Still runs extremely high, needs to work on pad level. If you watch the spring game, and he's just running upright. Struggled in pass protection all spring is what I heard. Fortunately, right, the other components of the offense should make life easier for Quinn Ewers. Offensive line returns everyone. I think there's actually going to be some upgrades past what you'll probably read in some of the preview magazines. Kelvin Banks Jr., what a year, right? Started as at left tackle as a true freshman. He wasn't even an early enrollee. Played all 13 games. Allowed a 1.4% pressure rate. Left guard Hayden Connor needs to be better in year 3, was below replacement level last season. Jake Majors at center is really valuable because of his ability to be a coach on the field, was fantastic in pass protection, was a liability in run blocking, so hopefully that gets a little bit better. Right guard is the position where I believe change happens, right? Cole Hudson started last season, was horrific. He missed spring after late season shoulder surgery. Opened the door for DJ Campbell. Campbell was the number 1 interior lineman in the 2022 class. I think Campbell wins that job. Actually delivered the best pass blocking grade of any Longhorn lineman last season, albeit just 129 snaps. Christian Jones at right tackle was a plus blocker in both run and pass, but word is Cam Williams is really pushing that competition. We'll see. My gut says Jones heads into week 1 as the starting tackle, but there's some competition there come fall. And then the weapons, right? It's really an embarrassment of riches for Quinn Ewers, and it's why it's going to be on him and Sark if Texas doesn't cruise to a Big 12 title. Xavier Worthy took a step back as a sophomore. Yards per route run dipped from 2.6 to 1.9. Drop rate more than doubled to 11%. Little overrated in my mind, but Worthy is undoubtedly damn good. Jordan Whittington is moving to the slot. That's a perfect fit for him. He was a running back in high school, damn good after the catch receiver. Sanders at tight end has the potential to be one of the best in the country after Brock Bowers. I do wonder a little bit about tight end 2, or God forbid Sanders goes down. Sark played a lot of 2 tight end sets last season. 35% of snaps was 2 tight end sets. It was a top 5 rate among Power 5 offenses. I just don't see a second guy or depth at tight end for Texas. Adonai Mitchell transfers in from Georgia, the number 1 portal wide receiver in the class. And then you have Jonte Cook, Ryan Niblett, and DeAndre Moore Jr., 3 freshmen that were all top 20 receivers in the 23 class. You still have Isaiah Neyor, right? The big transfer get last offseason from Wyoming. He's working his way back slowly after a second torn ACL, but a guy that averaged 2.9 yards per route run and had 12 touchdowns in 2021. The schedule is a little bit tougher, but it doesn't necessarily set up terribly, right? We're projecting 3 defenses outside the top 100, 3 more outside the top 60. The only defense projected in our top 25 is Alabama. So there are no excuses for the Longhorn offense this season.
Brad, if Payne is concerned about the Longhorn offense, I'm not quite sure how exactly
Don't say concerned.
I'm not
it's
exactly
relative
sure.
To market, right? They're being projected as the greatest
No one's
offense
calling
ever,
them
like top 5.
Well,
this is the most hyped team in college
They're
football.
the most hyped team every year in college football. I don't think people are confusing them with 2019 LSU and trying to expect them to replicate that. At least unless I'm missing something.
You must be missing something because that's the vibe.
All right, well, I'm missing a lot of things then, apparently, but that's a different discussion for a different day. Defensively, when we look at this Texas Longhorn team, Brad, Payne mentioned Pete Kwiatkowski, and it's only the second time since 2011 that Texas will have the defensive coaching staff returning intact, and there's a lot of optimism about what these guys were able to do. If there's one thing that's been noticeable about inconsistent seasons with Texas, the dudes that they're bringing in on the defensive side of the ball, a far cry from what we've grown accustomed to in the past, which is helping with some of that transition, obviously, that's on the horizon, getting into the SEC. But when you look at Texas's defense, where are your areas of optimism? And if there are concerns, what should we be looking for?
Well, this was a defense that took a major step up last year. It was, quite frankly, one of the most improved defenses in the country. Basic counting stats, you're talking about a defense last year allowed 1.1 yards per play less than they did in 2021. 9.5 points per game less than what they did in 2021. Rushing yards per game, about 75 yards per game less. Yards per carry, 1.6 yards per carry less than what they did a year ago. So, no doubt about it, Kwiatkowski, they took that leap. There are still, though, some opportunities for improvement because as good as what they were in the basic counting stats, didn't force a ton of turnovers. They were number 104 nationally in forced turnovers, only 14 of them. They led the country in quarterback pressures, but yet somehow 71st in sacks. So got to the quarterback, just couldn't get him down. And also 87th in fourth down conversion rate, 115th in points allowed after conversion. So in those types of categories, they can improve. And I think they can. Let's start up front. Now, they do lose a couple of really good defensive tackles that ended up getting drafted in the later rounds. A couple of big guys in Coburn and Ojimo. But they got a couple of really good defensive tackles back. Tavondre Sweat, 355 pounds. Byron Murphy, another 300-pounder. Both Sweat and Murphy, if you look at Pro Football Focus, ranked in the top 6 in the Big 12 in run defense. So a defensive tackle as good as anybody in the league. Defensive end, Sorrell is their main edge rusher. 9 tackles for loss, 5.5 sacks. He comes back. You look at linebacker, Jalen Ford, very productive. 119 tackles. Solid in the run game, 10 tackles for loss, 4 interceptions, 3 forced fumbles, 2 fumble recoveries. Certainly filled out the stat sheet with him. There's one kid that can come in and play right away from this outstanding recruiting class on the defense side of the ball. I think it's 5-star true freshman linebacker Anthony Hill, who really, to me, stood out in the spring game. I think he plays immediately, and they're going to move him around. I could also see him being one of those third down pass rush specialists. Pass defense needs to get better. That was one of their weaknesses on defense. Basic pass defensive counting stat, number 90 in the country. They lose a couple of starters in Cook and Jamison. The star position is, like typical other, you got to play 5 defensive backs typically in the Big 12. Barron's back there. Jaron Thompson's back in that secondary. They still went out and got a guy, Jalen Catalon, is a name, if you follow college football, you're familiar with. He's from Arkansas. The question is, can he stay healthy? Because if he is healthy, like going back to that 2020 season, he's All-American caliber when he is. So that could be a big missing piece in that pass defense. Overall, I mean, I like the talent that they're bringing in. I like the returning production. I like the coaching. I mean, this side of the ball typically has more questions than answers. I don't think that's the case this year.
When we look at Texas, guys, I mean, schedule-wise, Brad, anything that stands out to you? We know they have the massive non-conference game that'll be the crown jewel September 9th when they have the return trip to Alabama. Obviously, revenge on their mind. Texas doesn't appear to be much more than a touchdown dog. We'll see if that number sticks. But overall, when you look week 1 to week 13, what stands out to you for Texas?
Well, I mean, that's going to be their only underdog role is that Week 2 game against Alabama. Rewatching that game, they should have beaten Alabama last year. That was actually, I would say, an unfortunate loss because I thought they were the better team for a majority of that game. Other than that, I mean, look, it's not easy. There's not a lot of slam dunk wins, and this is a program that has not handled expectations well. They've lost, that Tom Herman, obviously better underdog coach than favorite. Sark, a lot of inconsistencies his first couple of years, but man, on paper, looking at it, this is a team that's going to be easily favored in 11 of their 12 games. So it's there for this team finally to make that run.
Texas is back. It's put up or shut up time for the Longhorns for their final season in the Big 12. We'll see if they're able to go out with a conference championship.
Brad.
Go ahead, Payne.
Yeah.
Let me just ask a question. We obviously know and think the world of Pete Kwiatkowski, but there was an integral member that was brought in who decided to step away in March. Do we think Gary Patterson helping with the defense? Did you do anything there for Texas with his stepping down?
No. I mean...
Okay.
No, I didn't.
Okay.
I still like some of the position coaches. I mean, up front, Bo Davis is one of my favorite guys. I think they'll be just fine.
Like you guys said, no excuses. I mean, Texas finally has to begin to turn all of this recruiting success and some of these high-profile players into actual stars on the football field, both on the offensive and defensive side. And to your point, Payne, I think a lot of that starts with all eyes on the quarterback position, knowing that there is a wealth of riches there and a very prominent name waiting in the wings should Quinn Ewers fail. Even if I don't think Steve Sarkisian would go to Arch Manning, when you look at the depth chart, Malik Murphy officially listed as the number 2. A program, gentlemen, on the rise in the conference and one of the more intriguing bunches when you look at how their odds have moved so far this offseason would be what's unfolding in West Texas and Lubbock with the Texas Tech Red Raiders, who see their win total at 7 at some books, heavily shaded to the over. Shop around as always. We've seen a little bit of movement on their odds to win the conference as low as 14-1 or even shorter at some spots. When you look at Texas Tech, for Joey McGuire, there was an interesting comment. He said, here's the deal for me. I understand and can relate to the Red Raiders from the standpoint of that we are going to be tough, we are going to have a chip on our shoulder, and we are going to go to work. I have that kind of mentality. I'm excited and happy to be there. I think the boosters have embraced that. As a result, Texas Tech has the most wins in a season since 2013, where they were also 8-5 in the first year under Cliff Kingsbury. 1954, though, was the first time the Texas Tech's football program won an outright conference championship. Kansas, West Virginia, and Texas Tech, the only 3 current Big 12 schools not to get to a conference title game, just 9 winning seasons in the league over the last 27 years of competition. I can go on, but that's all in the past as far as Texas Tech football is concerned. And Payne, the reason people are optimistic is because of what this offense can do. Zach Kittley lit a fire under them last season, 34.2 points per game, ranked 4th in the Big 12. They did average way too many turnovers, though, at nearly 2 per contest, most in the league. But incredibly enough, they were 8-2 when they recorded 3 or fewer turnovers. When you look at the Red Raiders, they were ultra aggressive. Finished with the fourth down attempts, 52 in the FBS, converted 33 of those to rank 16th in conversion percentage. But if the Red Raiders offense is going to light the world on fire, it starts with the quarterback position, and all signs point to Tyler Shuck regaining that QB1 mantra.
Yeah, I mean, we were high on Zach Keatley coming into last year. Had heard a lot of great things. He's one of those young offensive minds that I believe has a chance to be really good. And you mentioned some of the turnovers last year. A lot of it was because of the revolving door at quarterback. and that really tested Keatley, right? I mean, just, navigating 3 different quarterbacks playing substantial amounts, and somehow, the Tech turned out to be a top 25 offense in schedule adjusted EPA per play. And now you pair that extra year of experience calling plays and being the OC at this level with more than 80% of the offensive production returning. You can see why pros are really high on Texas Tech, and it's just a great staff, right? Joey McGuire and Keatley and Tim DeRuyter. I like that trio. You mentioned Tyler Shuck. They handed him the job, right? He's a starting quarterback, 3rd straight season. It's mostly because of his duality, right? He's able to be pretty mobile. He's 6'5", 230. He can run. You go back to the Texas Bowl against Ole Miss, goes for 111 rushing yards and 2 rushing touchdowns. I think the hope is that Shuck improves as a passer, and then he kind of picks his spots better as a runner, because he hasn't been able to play more than 7 games in a season with this style. You look at Shuck, he was actually better in 2021 as a thrower, in adjusted completion percentage 10% higher. He was substantially better under pressure. The one thing that I noticed when I dug into this team a little bit was that Keatley had Shuck push the ball further downfield. His rate of throws, 10-plus yards, increased more than 7% year over year, and it just didn't fit Shuck's game, right? So if I was looking at this, I would highly advise getting Shuck throwing with more play-action concepts, and it doesn't need to be your traditional 1998 form. I would probably limit Shuck from hunting as many deep balls and kind of target the areas where he's most comfortable throwing to. And it may sound robotic, but with Tech's pace wearing down defenses and the defensive quality in the Big 12 and Shuck's mobility, you don't have to be the most sophisticated passing attack. You just need more down-to-down efficiency. That was Tech's problem. They were outside the top 90 in passing success rate, which is shocking for an offense that, again, was top 25 in schedule-adjusted EPA per play. So if you can get the passing game to be a little bit more consistent down-to-down, this offense is really going to take off. Shuck needs some better play in front of him, too. Right, Tech's O-line was a bit of a disaster last season. It was kind of a combination of not being very good plus some poor injury luck. All told, if you look, Tech was outside the top 75 in havoc allowed, sacks allowed, and negative plays allowed. Tackles struggled mightily in the spring game, gave up pressures, gave up sacks, lots of batted passes. Tech is going to flip-flop their tackles, right? They're going to move Monroe Mills and Caleb Rogers around. Last year, Mills played right tackle, was a plus pass protector. He's now at left tackle. Caleb Rogers, I'm not sure he can play. We're now talking over 2,300 snaps of below replacement level production in 3 seasons. Maybe the shift to right tackle helps a little bit. I like the interior of the line. I think it's pretty solid. You bring in Rusty Stotts from Western Kentucky. He was a 3-star transfer center, graded out exceptionally well as a pass blocker the last 2 seasons. Tech's going to move Dennis Wilburn from center to guard. Wilburn, great story, right? Walk-on JUCO player, started at center immediately. I actually think he plays better at guard this season. And then you have Cole Spencer. Hopefully he can stay healthy. He's the 3rd man on the inside. He is the most talented guy, right? Transferred in from Western Kentucky last cycle, but got injured again. He has been fantastic as a pass blocking tackle for 3 seasons, but they're moving him inside because of some of those injuries. They think he's slowed down a tick. But if Tech can't get the tackle situation figured out, it would not be shocking to see Spencer kick back outside like at Western Kentucky, and then it's just much easier to find a body inside than it is, on the edge. If Tech can protect, right, and Shuck is just a touch more accurate, I think this has the potential to be a top 20 offense this season. The weapons are plentiful. That's where the returning production is. Top 5 receivers are back. Then you go out in the portal and add Dre McCray from Austin Peay. High 3-star kid, average 2.7 yards per route run. All signs are pointing to Jerran Bradley taking that next step. And then you look at Luke Fungi. Broke out in spring. Then had a massive 60-yard touchdown in the spring game. You still have Nehemiah Martinez, who's more of the wide receiver screen game guy. Miles Price is still around. Taj Brooks, solid running back, more of a pitter-patter, quick, choppy feet guy, not overly explosive, but keeps the pile moving. Decent hands out of the backfield, too. I think the hope is that Cameron Valdez is fully recovered from the knee injury. Got some burn in the spring game. He's more of the speed back. But the true positive for Tech's offense, it's the schedule. We're projecting the Red Raiders to face 1 top 35 defense all season. So I really like this offense and what it has in store for 2023.
If the offense has a high ceiling, Brad, if Texas Tech is going to find its way to move into the upper echelon of Big 12 powers, they're going to need a little bit more stability from this stop unit. And it's a group that does lose their highest drafted player ever in Tyree Wilson. Tim DeRuyter will have his hands full. And we start with the positive. I mean, this is a group that led the Big 12 in sacks with 31 and had the 9th best red zone defense in all of the FBS last season. But that's probably the extent of the silver lining, because when you dig into a lot of the other defensive metrics, it was the same old Texas Tech Red Raiders. What are your expectations for this group, knowing they're not going to be asked to pitch shutouts by any stretch of the imagination? They just have to provide enough resistance, force enough turnovers, and create enough havoc to allow the offense to go out there, operate in space, and hang 35-plus points per game.
So I got a slight downgrade from last year. I mean, obviously, when you lose one of your best talents in the history of the school, in Tyree Wilson, a guy 27.5 tackles for loss, 14 sacks the last 2 years. That's a significant loss. You also lose your top 2 tacklers, inside linebacker, Merriweather, very productive kid the last couple of years, 100-plus tackles a year ago. Eldridge came onto the scene last year, was one of the biggest surprises on the defense. He's gone at linebacker, so missing 3 of their best players, so a slight downgrade there. But I'm pretty confident. I mean, Tim DeRuyter's smart. He's been around the block. Some basic counting stats, like you mentioned, were terrible last year. Number 107 in total defense, number 92 in scoring defense. Not sure that they're ever going to be, a defense known to be in the top 50 in those couple of metrics. But, what can they do? They get after the quarterback. They were number 16 in defensive line havoc. You mentioned the sacks leading the Big 12. Once they kind of bend, but they didn't break, being in the top 10 in the country in red zone defense. And for a team that loses an outstanding talent in Tyree Wilson, I got to tell you, watching the spring game, if there's one position I liked, was the edge. I mean, they got a couple of guys, Miles Cole, who they're really high on, and think maybe not as dynamic as Wilson, but he's 6'6", 285. He's going to fill that gap there. Steve Linton's a transfer from Syracuse, a little bit light in the britches at 235, but he's 6'5", has great length. In the pass rush, I don't think they missed too much of a beat. If there's another thing that surprised me, was just the overall size of this entire team. I mean, they looked much bigger, at least compared to the other Big 12 teams and even other teams nationally. So I looked at it. Are my eyes deceiving myself? Is there different camera angles? They're playing their spring game at some local high school, so maybe I'm just not watching this correctly. So I actually physically printed out their roster, counted. Texas Tech has 22 guys on their roster, 300-plus pounds. Put that in perspective. Georgia looks just bigger than everybody else. Georgia has 23. So they're right in the realm of Georgia as far as size-wise there. So, I mean, at least compared to the Big 12, they're massive. Starting at defensive tackle, they got a couple of 300-pounders, Jalen Hutchings and Tony Bradford. Tony Bradford's one of the better defensive linemen, at least at tackle, in the conference with 9 TFLs last year. And Hutchings was productive as well. I like that Ledet kid they bring in from UL Monroe, another 300-pounder on the defensive front to give them some depth there. I did mention that inside linebacker is the biggest question. We'll see a couple of transfers they have on the back end, a back 7. That Baskerville kid at the star position from San Diego State, I think is going to be a good gift for them. They had a safety, Taylor Emerson, that was relatively productive. Just watching, the spring game, for a team not known for their defense, I was impressed with the tackling. They didn't look overwhelmed. It's an experienced defense, even losing a couple guys. I mean, they're old. They have 10 super seniors on the defense side of the ball. So you got to downgrade them for losing their 3 best talents. But overall, I don't think they take too big of a step back. I still, overarching for this program, it is on the incline. I think, they just touched the surface last year. Their recruiting class was their best finish in almost 15 years. They got another recruiting class on the way that's going to be just as good, if not better. And Joey McGuire's pretty confident. I mean, at the start of spring practice, he thought this year's team right now beats last year's team by 14 points. I didn't upgrade Texas Tech's power rating 14 points, but I could see it. And we're going to get a good look at Texas Tech week 2 against Oregon. That's a winnable game for them.
I mean, look, it's not just week 2. I know they're a bigger favorite on the road in Laramie, but that's also not an easy place to play if conditioning isn't up to snuff at one of the highest altitudes in all of D1. So you talk about a non-conference schedule that could serve as a good litmus test. After the first 2 weeks, Texas Tech will either establish an identity or be looking for a new one before they get into the thick of Big 12 play. And when we talk about identity, we haven't done a deep dive on a lot of the new programs coming into the conference, but one that does catch the eye of everyone. Payne mentioned them at the top of the show with some of the pedigree, the recruiting footprint, and a former SEC coach at the helm. That would be Central Florida. And when we look at their win total, it's 7. They're 40-1 outsiders to win the conference coming into the season. And one of the biggest questions that UCF, along with the Houstons and the Cincinnati of the worlds, were asked, did they have enough depth to make the transition to a Power 5 conference? And Gus Malzahn said, we've been building up, trying to get our roster ready. I feel we do anytime you move up a level. You have to be deep. I feel we are. I think more than anything, building your program, the culture around the program, a lot of moving parts. We think we're in a good spot. This is a championship program. We're going to continue to build upon that. Obviously, Gus has the resume of winning at a Power 5 conference school at Auburn. UCF won 9 games for the second straight season under Malzahn, who's now 18-9 in his 2 seasons there. And when you look at what UCF needs to win, they're 17-2 when they get to 160 yards rushing and 1-7 when they don't. 7th consecutive bowl appearance for the program. And there's no doubt UCF may embrace being the new kid on the block here. As far as this team offensively, Brad, we can make the case that I'm not sure that John Reese Plumlee should have been the starting quarterback. They might have wanted to work a little bit harder to keep Mikey Keene from transferring to Fresno State. But Darren Hinshaw takes over as offensive coordinator, played quarterback at UCF in the 90s. A lot of their counting stats were elite, but residing in the AAC, a far cry from competing in the Big 12, where you're going to be tested on a week-in, week-out basis.
Yeah, I will say this. I think it's pretty consensus, not breaking news, but of the 4 new schools, this is the program in the best shape. And Payne mentioned at the top that if there's one school that can continue that upwards trajectory in the New Look League after Texas and Oklahoma leave, it is UCF. Now, they just recruited their top class in school history. It would have ranked first in the AAC. And the new Big 12 is number 9, so they still have some work to do as far as continuing that trajectory. Although, if you look at this upcoming class, they're doing a good job there. You mentioned the new OC. Obviously, I still think Malzahn's going to be still heavily involved with the offense, but you like that Hinshaw has experienced already, familiar with the area as far as a recruiting profile. He was UAB OC last year. I don't think it changes too much. Plumlee's back. Dynamic athlete, obviously, but for as good as he is in the run game, leaves a lot to be desired in the throw game. And I mentioned when he got banged up last year, at least early on before their defensive issues it really became a problem for them. I thought Mikey Keene was going to be just fine, and he was. I think they went on the road and beat Tulane one of those games. You mentioned it. They, with Keene off to Fresno State, they had to bring in some transfers for some depth there. Timmy McClain from USF, Xavier Williams from Charlotte was added. But the positive, I would say, as far as depth, what's ready to go immediately, I think, is the running back room. R.J. Harvey is back dynamic, 6.7 yards per carry. Johnny Richardson, 6.9 yards per carry. This was a top 10 rushing offense in the country a year ago in a basic counting stat. You add a former 5-star from Florida and Clemson and DeMarcus Bowman. You're good to go at running back at the Power 5 level. Wide receiver, they already have a bunch of guys that played Power 5 football. Alabama wide receiver Javon Baker, he led UCF last year with nearly 800 yards. You got a former Auburn wide receiver in Kobe Hudson. He was 16.4 yards per catch a year ago. I thought they had a really good pickup. Corey Gamage was supposed to go to Purdue. He was at Marshall last year, their big play threat guy. And they flipped him from Purdue. He's going to go to UCF. So another dynamic guy that can really stretch the defense in the receiver room. I think the tight end, Holler's fine. If there's one group that's the biggest question mark, not only in the offense, but I think maybe even in the entire team, it's going to be the offensive line. The only guy back is the Paule kid. I'm sure I'm butchering that name, but he was first team all-conference a year ago. Their left tackle's back. But worries me, though, is watching a bunch of these spring games. I'm watching Miami's spring game, and the talk of Miami's spring, at least up front, is this center, Matt Lee, a 3-year guy that was a starter at UCF. And they're acting like he's, one of the leaders of the Miami football program. So to lose a guy like that from, going to Miami from UCF, I think that's a massive loss for them up front. They bring in, like all these teams, experienced transfers. Fresno State transfer is expected to take his place in Bula Schmidt. He has 31 career starts. They bring in transfers from Stanford and Alabama. Also a Kent State kid that was first-team All-MAC last year, and Marcellus Marshall. So inexperience and a question mark there, especially with the step up in class. But overall, I got to say they're about as good as what they were a year ago. It's going to fall on Plumlee's going to have to be more consistent throwing the football. If he's not, then, they're going to make him pay in this league.
Do we think Plumlee, Brad, has more in him? I mean, we saw, obviously, the completion percentage up. We know he's an electric athlete. I mean, he burst onto the scene as a run-first, change-of-pace guy at Ole Miss. But I wonder about his pocket presence and them being able to design an offense, because the other thing, too, and we'll get to the defensive side of the ball, when he breaks contain and he goes for runs, he better make sure he gets down. It's a little bit different getting hit by defensive backs in the Big 12 than it is going up against Navy and East Carolina on a week-in, week-out basis.
So this is in the weeds. I'm not sure that he does. He's a baseball player. A lot of spring practices at Ole Miss, were spent playing baseball. So I'm all for a guy taking reps, and you get better. You should get better with the reps. I'm not sure that he'll be able to take that next step, especially with increased competition. Just not sure.
Well, if we have questions about the quarterback position, I think we'll have plenty of questions, Payne, about what this group can do defensively. Addison Williams takes over for Travis Williams as defensive coordinator, and you look at UCF. I mean, this was a group that allowed 157 rushing yards per game last year, 6 interceptions as a team, and barely struggled to eclipse 20 sacks on the season. You're going to need improvement pretty much everywhere. I'm not going to say that the cupboard is completely bare, but they could find adjusting to life as a Big 12 defense to be a far cry from what they've grown accustomed to as members of the AAC.
Yeah, I think if you're trying to make a case for UCF kind of being the darling or the surprise team, you can talk yourself into some things defensively. The good thing about Addison Williams is he's going to stick with a 4-2-5 formation, and UCF does return over 70% of its defensive production. So the coaching transition should be relatively seamless. UCF's defensive line was interesting, right? It was more aggressive, penetrating downhill, so they would cause some havoc. They'd create some negative plays. They would stand up pretty well at the point of attack, but they weren't consistent. And Addison Williams has preached consistency all offseason, right? That's the buzzword used by every UCF player and coach anytime a mic is in their face. You have Morris Brash and Ricky Barber back, 134 pressures and run stops combined between them. Lee Hunter's second year in the scheme after transferring in from Auburn last offseason. Hunter was the 5th best player in the state of Alabama in the 21 class. Good run defender. I'd like to see Matthew Alexander get more snaps this season. He actually graded out UCF's best defender. I'm not sure where all of the Josh Salazar love comes from, 3 seasons of replacement level play. I think we'll have to pay attention to Derek LeBlanc, that situation, see if he gets his transfer waiver. It was a 4-star kid from the 23 class, then enrolled at Oklahoma 5 months ago, wanted out before the season started. John Walker, a top 100 player in the 23 class as well. He'll play on the interior. I think he probably gets some burn right away. The biggest thing for UCF's front, right, and something you alluded to, is pressure. Like, where does the pressure come from? Who gets the quarterback to the ground? Whether it was standard downs or known passing situations, UCF was outside the top 100 in sack rate. Linebacker room, it's interesting, right? Like, others seem to be higher on it than me. Jason Johnson did transition well from East Illinois to UCF last cycle, was good against the run, good in coverage, was UCF's best tackler by a mile. And that was a problem for UCF, right? All the way from the D-line to the back end, UCF was outside the top 85 in tackling, and now you're transitioning to a conference with far better offenses, far better athletes, far bigger. It's partly why there was this dichotomy in the defensive run metrics, right? UCF was top 25 in the country in rushing success rate defense, but they're outside the top 80 in EPA per rush because they'd missed tackles, they weren't sound in their assignments, and both led to some gashers. Other linebacker position, I think, figures itself out, right? There's a lot of hype for Walter Yates if you do some reading. His transition from Savannah State to UCF was a struggle. I'm just going to put that nicely, right? Was horrific against the run, 18% missed tackle rate for his career. And then in coverage, Yates allowed a 135 passer rating and 94% of targets to be caught last season. It's why UCF hit the portal for 3 backers despite only playing 2 at a time. You have Rion Davis coming in from Georgia, was a top 100 recruit, now 3-star transfer, only played 212 snaps in 3 seasons at Georgia, but his strong suit is tackling. Isaiah Paul comes in from Incarnate Word. 3 weeks ago, Sean Peterson Jr. entered the mix from FIU. So there's at least some guys there now that I think they believe are good. We'll have to see. Secondary, to your point, Todd, a little bit of a mystery. The unit was outside the top 75 in both passing success rate and explosive passing. Now you enter the Big 12. Corey Thornton, coming off back-to-back great seasons, allowed a 55% reception rate when targeted and graded out UCF's best tackler, if you can believe that, from the secondary. Brandon Adams, needs to make that third-year leap. Did improve last season. You bring in DeCorian Peterson from MTSU for a 6th season. Fine college player. Last 2 seasons allowed 54% of targets to be caught. Fantastic tackler as well. You can kind of gather the theme here. Fred Davis, a Clemson transfer, is in the mix, was a top 100 player in the 2020 class. Did play 500 snaps in 3 seasons for the Tigers. Likely a depth piece. Hopefully a depth piece for them if they want the secondary to be better. Jaire Wilson, I think, has to be a starter. Transfers in from ECU, solid contributor the last 2 seasons. Past that, question marks at safety. You have DeJordan Mask from Texas State who comes in. He's entering year 5. Maybe the light came on last season. It was his first above replacement level. You have Quadric Bullard, who is still in the mix as well. Huge if he could return to his 21 form. Damari Henderson was a 3 high-star kid from the 2022 class, played above replacement level as a freshman. So there are some options at safety, just nothing really proven at this point. And you look at UCF, right? They just have to get it figured out early on defense. Addison Williams basically has 3 games against Kent State, Boise, and Villanova to kind of iron out the kinks, fix the bugs, get acclimated, right? Because the final 9 games, there is 1 offense on UCF's schedule we're projecting outside the top 50. That is it. It is a murderer's row of offenses down the stretch. So I'm not as high on UCF's defense this season, and I think ultimately that's kind of what limits their ceiling. I believe UCF was kind of the beloved long shot from a lot of professional bettors, but even though they're the best of the new entrants, I still think maybe a season or 2 away, once Texas and Oklahoma clear out, have that second great recruiting class in 2024 come in, and then you're kind of positioned better in the new look Big 12.
I'll say one thing. UCF lucked out with the way the schedule as far as road games are concerned shapes up over the last month of the season. The only cold weather environment they'll have to go to is Cincinnati, and it's a place they're familiar with. So UCF fans can rejoice. They don't have to travel into icy rain and everything else you'll have to deal with in the Big 12, at least this year, when you get into meaningful November football games. Gentlemen, we've done an extensive deep dive on most of the relevant programs within the conference. Encourage all of our loyal listeners to follow Brad on Twitter at BradPower7. They can follow Payne there as well at Payne Insider. I'm Todd Fuhrman. Follow me on social media. Most importantly, though, follow the podcast at BetTheBoardPod. And while I know a lot of fans out there going, what the hell? No Houston, no Cincinnati, no Iowa State. BYU fans can rejoice because we'll offer up a quick preview of the Cougars right now. And when you look at BYU going from an independent into a actual conference for the first time in over a decade, their win total seen some under money. We're now looking at a 5.5, pretty much the prevailing price tag, 100-1. And this is a BYU program that has 5 straight seasons of 7+ wins. They're 29-9 as a program over the last 3 years, 16 winning seasons in the last 17, and 17 bowl appearances in the last 18. Win or lose, let's be honest, BYU becomes a talking point now that it's in the Big 12, and it actually has a rather large footprint, as we know it's the flagship university for the Mormon Church. Kalani Sitake, some strong comments. We understand the sense of urgency needed. Back in April, we know what the schedule looks like. I mean, in years past, it has always been get ready for a front-loaded schedule, and the first game is always big, and there are a high number of Power 5s early in the season. Well, unfortunately for BYU, there's not a lot of soft landing spots in the latter portion of the campaign, so they're going to get tested right out of the gates. We know this is a program that's trying to raise more money. They're looking to expand their footprint. Unfortunately for BYU, though, they bring in a retread quarterback, and I say that ever so graciously because I love what Keaton Slovis did when he was at USC, but when you continue to get recycled and you can't take over that Pitt offense, it's a little bit scary. So he'll assume the reins from Jaron Hall and Zach Wilson before him. This was an offense that was 11th, though, in FBS and passing efficiency and 14th in touchdown passes. And when you look at the 5th year of eligibility, clearly it's learning a new offense and high expectations there. As far as some of the playmakers are concerned, the receiving core is neither here nor there. Puka Nacua ends up going to the Rams. He was the team leader a season ago, but they did do well in the portal in terms of a running back. They bring in Aiden Robbins, who a lot of people are optimistic about how he'll be able to adjust to life in a power conference after running for over 1,000 yards with 9 scores, can catch the ball as well. Offensive line, Brad talked about the Barrington brothers and how difficult it's going to be to replace that tandem who ended up at Baylor, but you do add a very excellent center coming from Utah in the Holy War rivalry and Paul Melee, along with an Oklahoma State transfer in Caleb Etienne. Defensively, Jay Hill steps in from Weber State, and this is a defense that's going to need players to step up and start making plays. We know they're older, and there are a lot of grown men on that side of the ball, but guys, watching BYU last year, tell me if I'm wrong, they didn't look that athletic. They didn't look that quick. And life in this conference, Brad, ain't going to be that forgiving. But if there are other things that you've highlighted in your handicap of BYU going into the season, by all means, fill in some of the gaps. And curious to get your take on exactly where the win total sits right now.
No, I think you hit it with the word athletic. Obviously, you're Division I athletes. You're athletic. But as far as high-end elite athletes, be able to stretch the field over the top, particularly on offense, I don't see it. High-end athletes on the defense side of the ball, they can get pressure on the quarterback, play in space, because you got to play in space with these offenses you're going to be defending. I didn't see it watching the spring game. Look, as far as in the trenches, from a physical standpoint, they'll be just fine in the new league. Although I do worry about competitive depth. If you've watched BYU football last 10, 15 years with those front-loaded independent schedules, what happens typically is, they play, pretty comparably well against, the Power 5 teams. I mean, losing records since 2011, 25-30 straight up, but a lot of it was of an extremely poor record against Utah, their rival. I mean, outside of Utah, they were 24-22, so right around 500 against Power 5 teams. But what would happen is, after playing 4 or 5 Power 5 teams at the start of the schedule, they get banged up, then they lose a couple games, 1 or 2 that they have no business losing, and now you don't get that. You get 2 cream puffs to start, and then 10 straight Power 5 opponents, starting with a road trip to Arkansas that kind of exposed them last year in Provo. I do like their new defensive coordinator, Jay Hill from Weber State, but this is to me, on the surface, obviously Cincinnati and Houston's going to be, projects, I think. But BYU's also, for a team that's won as many games as they have the last, few years, I still think this is a transition, similar to what we saw Utah. It took a couple years to get adjusted to the Pac-12. I think we're seeing something similar here. I'm kind of a little bit pessimistic on BYU this year. I was part of that under money.
This almost sounds like a team that would have been better served to make the move a couple of years ago, whether it was Zach Wilson at the helm, and I'm sure the Jets would have liked to see BYU play a Power 5 schedule, so they may not have ended up with Zach Wilson as a top 3 pick. Jaron Hall, when he was healthy, was a dynamic quarterback, both as a runner and as a passer, but there's no doubt, to your point, Brad, I think BYU is going to take a little while to catch up, but I think it's a program with a rich football tradition that'll be just fine and benefit immensely from being in a conference. Gentlemen, 10 schools effectively handicapped as best as we know how to do. We've covered north of 2 hours, but our job still is not done. It's the best bet portion of the program, and I'll open up the floor to either one of my esteemed colleagues here to take the reins and lead us to the promised land.
Go ahead and take it.
So, we'll do a little combination here. I think, people will listen to how I describe Texas as an offense and be like, how is this possible? But the one thing that's interesting about what we've chosen to do here, right, and bring Brad into the fold, obviously, great dude, raised well, acumen for college football is off the charts. But he likes to spray the board, right? If he finds an edge, it's going in. I'm a little bit on the other end where it's like I'm being picky, right? I'm trying to find reasons not to bet things, and why this works so well for the listener is we kind of meet in the middle. And
Brad,
so,
Payne also goes through a restaurant menu the exact same way, so I'm glad to see his betting tendencies carry over the exact same traits.
So, again, like my, skepticism for Texas was relative to the hype, relative to perception, relative to where people are projecting them. But I still think they're tiers above the rest of this conference, especially with some of the new entrants. And the reason we didn't talk about many of the new entrants is because, Houston and Cincinnati and BYU very much all in transition years. UCF really the only one that feels like, they can kind of hold their own in year one. We kind of discussed off air on how we wanted to attack Texas, and I'm not really sure we came to the perfect method. So rather than kind of put our head in a blender, why don't we just split a position, go half over 9.5 wins minus, call it 110 is out there, and then half to win the Big 12 conference plus $1.25. And Brad, if that works for you, I'll let you kind of maybe discuss Texas a little bit more. And I think that's probably the best approach, is just kind of split the position between the two rather than rack our brain and figure out which one.
No, I love it. I like it a lot, to be honest with you. The fact that kind of surprised. You want to talk about pull behind the curtain? I just got surprised at that you did decide to bust that up. And I actually think you came to the correct decision by splitting it up. First, we talk about the league, and certainly, Texas, a team that has not, you talk about a season win total. Texas has only gone over their season win total one time since 2011. So that is a concern. But
Brad, they're due.
Yeah, they're due, the due factor. But with that being said, let's just look at basic metrics. My power rankings. I love my power rankings. And when I say I spray the board, I'm using my power rankings. When I'm betting 100-plus season win totals, I'm using my power ratings. And the reality is, this Texas roster is head and shoulders above everybody else in this conference. On a neutral field, they're 5.5, 6 points better than the next best team, that being Oklahoma, who still has a ton of questions. Kansas State and TCU, I think we both expect to take a step back after making the Big 12. Baylor still has question marks. Oklahoma State has question marks. None of the 4 teams really coming in my opinion, are going to be able to contend. So I just think the reality is, Quinn Ewers has got to be awful and not progress whatsoever. Sark, has to show complete inconsistency yet again. And even then, I still, don't think this team's capable of winning 9-10 games. So I like the fact that we split it up a little bit, especially to get that plus money. These are two, plus money on the conference future. These are 2 bets that I made, and I'm pretty confident. I'm obviously always confident when I'm making a bet, but this is one that I'm really confident in. As far as the conference future is one of my biggest conference future bets that I made.
Gentlemen,
for grading purposes, I screwed the poocher. Let's call it Texas over 9.5 minus $1.20, and then for the conference, we'll call it plus $1.25. A little movement this morning, but 9.5 over minus 20 on the total, and then plus 125 for the conference.
I haven't been this surprised by something taking place on the podcast since Brad's review of Sisu when Payne wasn't here to defend the other side of the equation. So, this really threw a wrench into my Wednesday morning before I'm ready to go on a little bit of a vacation here.
Well, I peeled back the curtain before recording, and you guys thought I just gave the death blow to Texas. But again, for our listeners, when we're talking about some of these teams, right, we're sports bettors. So a lot of it should be understood that it's relative to market. It's relative to perception. And so I just like looking at the other side of the coin. I'm still, little hesitant on Quinn Ewers, but they're just light years more talented than everyone in this conference. So I think that's probably the best method. I did text Brad mid-show. He didn't get that text. There was another option, but I just kind of steady Eddie. Let's go with this one with Texas and split that position between the win total and the conference future.
That's because Brad is a consummate professional. We have his undivided attention, unlike the two of us that sometimes go back and forth, and we deliberating a best bet for the better part of an hour every single Thursday during the NFL season, and we still oftentimes can't reach a consensus by the time that portion of the program rolls around. But gentlemen, it's been fun. We obviously have one conference left to go. We save the best for last like we always do around the Bet the Board home offices, but you're going to have to wait a little while for our loyal listeners for the SEC. That won't come out until later July. We'll take a hiatus, vacation for me. Payne, we're not letting you out of the lab because you were off the entire time that Brad and I were doing the heavy lifting for Group of 5 conferences. Brad, hopefully you get a little bit of R&R, but It's incredible the amount of ground we're able to cover. I know some of these podcasts go longer, which can be a little bit overwhelming for some new college football bettors that are just stumbling on Bet the Board for the first time. But the greatest part about all this, when you do them months before the season starts, break them up into individual teams, take them in bite sizes, go back, listen multiple times. There's so much information, and we're able to give you real-time intel much more effectively than any of the publications, given the college football landscape we're currently in. I'll leave the final word to you guys if you have anything you'd like to share before we reconvene for the SEC later in July.
Monday, July 24th is the SEC podcast. You, sir, are going to be frolicking with Simba in the safari. You leave tomorrow. Brad is out of town, and I appreciate you being very fatherly, but I'm going to be out of town as well. I'm not divulging where I'm going, but somewhere in the middle of the country, going to set some stuff up. I figured that was an opportune time while you were away.
Look at you, being smart, being strategic, and taking advantage of that. But the channel will not be dark. We'll still have some NASCAR coverage there, and it gives the listeners the perfect window to go back and catch up on any of the coverage they may have missed. The win total ships may have sailed for some of these teams, but the information is just as relevant now as it was when we recorded it before. So for Brad Powers, Payne Insider, I'm Todd Fuhrman, guys. Enjoy a little bit of a respite and some summer break, because when we come back, it's pedal to the metal, football season right around the corner, and instead of preseason previews, it's all about actionable elements as we start the countdown towards week 0 and we begin to figure out how this college football landscape will play out. Most importantly, as always, though, with a Texas win total over the posted total and Texas to win the conference, we'll see you at the window.
Thanks for listening to Bet the Board. You can catch Todd and Payne every Monday, Wednesday, and Thursday during football season, breaking down the biggest NFL and college football games. And to make sure you don't miss any free best bets, subscribe to Bet the Board on iTunes, Google Play, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts.